Sitting alone in his desk chair, the young man wrestled with a persistent conviction. The creatures known as women never brought anything good into his life. At the very least, he had yet to experience otherwise. Across the room, Tuka laughed softly as she conversed with a classmate, her cheerful demeanor radiating an easy warmth that effortlessly drew the attention of everyone around her. Observing her popularity from a distance, he stood near the hallway wall with a look of mild detachment while fellow students bustled past. Beside him, an outgoing classmate watched the students in the corridor, whereas he remained quiet, completely uninterested in engaging in idle gossip. Suddenly, his friend draped an arm over his shoulders and began gushing loudly about how unbelievably cute Tuka was, calling out in excitement while he stood by, entirely unimpressed. Taking a slow sip from his juice box, he bluntly questioned his friend's intelligence for making such an over-the-top display over a classmate. His friend fiercely defended his admiration, arguing that nothing could surpass Tuka's charm and pointing out that he too had been caught staring at her. He quickly rejected the claim, asserting he was merely looking in that direction by pure accident before telling his friend to stop adding affectionate suffixes to her name because it sounded creepy. Rather than backing off, his companion leaned in dramatically and teasingly demanded to know what his ideal type of girl actually was, prompting a look of utter disgust from him. Meanwhile, further along the crowded hallway, other female students passed each other in mid-conversation, completely oblivious to the dramatic exchange behind them. Standing in the bustling school hallway, Shinya harbored a deep-seated conviction that women were nothing but trouble, while his friend rambled beside him as female classmates walked past. With a dull, unblinking glare, he silently maintained that women were entirely impossible to understand and that their true intentions remained completely inscrutable. Watching a group of girls chat and laugh together down the hall, he genuinely struggled to comprehend them, wondering if they were even the same type of creature as himself. Even when Tuka turned back to offer a warm, radiant smile in their direction, his cynical monologue resisted the charm, though a faint speck of doubt brushed through his mind. Beside him, his companion immediately sputtered in flustered delight over Tuka's glance, but the unimpressed youth remained thoroughly indifferent to her charm. Glancing back through the glass windows at the lively hallway, he reconfirmed his personal belief that getting involved with girls would only lead to headaches. Having had enough of lingering around, he abruptly announced his intention to head back, turning around to walk away. As they made their way back, his friend accidentally bumped into Shimamura, causing her to stagger. The quiet, dark-haired girl merely adjusted her glasses and coldly advised them to be careful. Staring after her as she walked away with an intimidating aura, his friend shivered nervously, whispering about how terrifying she appeared, while he simply observed the exchange. Before he could move any further, 2 gentle taps on his shoulder brought him to a halt, prompting him to glance back with quiet curiosity. He turned as Tuka cheerfully bounded up to him with a bright morning greeting, addressing him casually before leaning in close with a sly smirk to whisper his name. She leaned in closer, her light-hearted demeanor contrasting sharply with her sudden question about whether he had seen the news regarding the phantom serial killer's newest victim. All around them in the hallway, other students whispered nervously among themselves, wondering how many victims had fallen so far and questioning what the police were doing to stop it. Turning back to him with that same playful grin, she teased that the situation was truly terrifying and dangerous, though her casual tone betrayed no real fear. He mentally dismissed the dramatic title given to the murderer as sounding cheap and cliché, yet the stark reality remained. Over the past 6 months in Kisaragi town, 5 victims had already been brutally stabbed without any apparent pattern or discrimination. Looking out toward the quiet cityscape beyond the school walls, the haunting reality lingered over the town. The killer remained at large, untracked and unfound. Noticing his quiet reflection, she tilted her head in silent curiosity, prompting him to mentally retract his earlier cynicism as he looked away. As students continued to stream past the classroom windows, the indiscriminate nature of the killer's prey served as a grim reminder that no one was truly safe. Observing the ordinary world from high above, he quietly resolved himself to the absurdities of life, accepting that strange people would always exist in a world inherently defined by its oddities. Within the quiet room, the empty desk stood motionless, leaving a heavy stillness in the air as the morning chatter faded into silence. The ambient chatter of the classroom was a familiar backdrop, yet an unsettling strangeness lingered beneath the surface of ordinary school life. Stepping into the hallway, his path was abruptly interrupted by a silent figure waiting near the doorway, addressing him with a formal, reverence-filled title. The dark-haired girl stood motionless, her unblinking glare fixed on him with a chilling, intense focus that seemed to cut right through the bustling corridor. Handing over the requested book, her shadow enveloped him as he offered a quiet word of thanks, bewildered by her persistent, eerie demeanor. She immediately pressed further, confronting him with sharp accuracy about a conversation he had held earlier that afternoon with another woman. Shocked that she had been watching his every move, he listened as the quiet girl boldly declared that keeping vigil over him was her sacred duty as Yuruko Banju. Her strange behavior made sense only in light of her reputation. A solitary student who avoided all idle chatter, consumed entirely by the books in the quiet corners of the library. During his first year, a chance errand had led him to speak to her for the very first time amidst the towering bookshelves. Following that initial encounter, brief exchanges became a routine whenever they crossed paths, until one fateful day transformed her attitude entirely. Staring into his eyes with absolute conviction, she proclaimed that in a past life he was the monarch of a small realm, and she was the loyal knight bound by memory and duty to protect him. She continued to rant endlessly about past life loyalty, missions, and sworn protection, leading him to conclude that she was simply a delusional and deeply unhinged woman. In response to his indifference, she sternly warned him never to speak with Satsuki again, asserting that the girl was up to no good, though he coldly brushed off her demands as none of her concern. Faced with his persistent defiance, her expression darkened into a chilling, silent glare as her frustration reached its absolute boiling point. Turning away from her imposing presence with a tired sigh, he announced that he had to meet someone else and strictly forbade her from following him. As he descended the stairwell and headed out into the afternoon, she remained standing at the top of the steps, watching his departing figure in quiet isolation. Shortly thereafter, he arrived at a massive residential apartment complex, making his way along the exterior corridors toward a specific unit. Upon reaching the target doorway, he pressed the intercom button to speak, receiving immediate permission to enter from the voice on the other end. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal Shimamura, who greeted him with a mixture of quiet nervousness and subtle expectation. Stepping inside, he asked if he was late, but she reassured him that he was right on time before asking him to wait while she went to prepare. Moments later, behind closed doors, their private rendezvous took an astonishing turn as he wielded a whip over her bound and willing form in an intense session of discipline. He continued to hurl harsh insults at her, striking her repeatedly with the whip while she wept and stammered desperate apologies, overwhelmed by the intense experience. Clarifying his own position, he insisted inside his mind that he harbored no personal interest or pleasure in such eccentric activities. Instead, this entire scenario was entirely Masami's idea, satisfying her own hidden identity as an extreme masochist. Recalling their past, he had known her since middle school, where she was universally regarded as an exemplary honors student beyond suspicion. Yet behind that pristine facade, she had harbored these secret desires all along, a hidden truth he had stumbled upon purely by accident. Since that discovery, she had latched onto him as a trusted partner willing to accommodate her strange and private routine. With the ordeal finally drawing to a close, she lay exhausted on the floor, panting heavily from the physical strain. Promptly getting up, he unceremoniously nudged her with his shoe and instructed her to tidy up the room while undoing her restraints. As he prepared to leave, she offered a flushed, breathless note of thanks for his participation. Stepping out into the heat outside, he voiced a casual complaint about the weather, entirely unaware that Yuruko was standing silently in the background watching his every move. He dismissed her solemn warnings as she pleaded with him to cut ties with Shimamura, citing her vulgar behavior and questionable status. Refusing to tolerate the interference, he made it clear that despite her flaws, Shimamura was his friend and her actions were none of anyone else's business. Returning home shortly after the tense exchange, he collapsed into his desk chair with a heavy sigh, letting the weary stillness of his room settle over him. The night passed in quiet monotony, the gentle hum of the ceiling light casting soft shadows across the discarded notebook and mechanical pencil on his desk. His solitude was abruptly broken by the rhythmic chime of his mobile phone, snapping open the device to find a sudden message awaiting his attention. The brief text urgently summoned him to the local park at once, prompting him to slip back out into the cool midnight corridor without delay. Stepping out into the dark streets, he immediately sensed a familiar presence lurking just behind a utility pole, revealing that the persistent maiden had trailed him into the night. Turning back toward her, he demanded that she turn around and go home, emphasizing that he had no desire for an escort, yet she stubbornly insisted on accompanying him regardless. Continuing his walk along the quiet alleyway, he lamented how constantly he found himself pushed around by the women in his life, only for a voice in the darkness to call out his full name. The voice belonged to Akari Satsuki, his childhood friend who had been a sensitive crybaby always trailing behind him 10 years ago before moving away to a distant place. Upon reaching the park, he was greeted by her erratic figure standing under the moonlight, her face smeared with blood and sporting a sinister smile as she cheerfully welcomed him back into her life. She gleefully pointed toward the blood-soaked body lying at her feet, proudly presenting the corpse as if she had uncovered a grand treasure. Observing her playful indifference to the horror before them, he realized with quiet dismay just how thoroughly she had changed in the 10 years since they had last seen each other. When he asked who the unfortunate victim was, she merely wiped her face and casually admitted that she had no idea. As he turned to leave, questioning why she had summoned him to a fresh crime scene where he could be implicated, she pouted and claimed she had only wanted him to be the very first person to see her gruesome gift. Unmoved by her twisted affection, he offered a mundane excuse about returning home to watch a new anime broadcast, leaving her alone with her grim discovery. Leaving the park behind, he walked alone through the quiet, concrete walls of an empty passageway. Sensing a presence lingering behind him, he halted and glanced over his shoulder, catching sight of someone peeking around the corner. The pursuer stepped out into full view, revealing herself to be Tuka, who had been stealthily tailing him through the night. She offered a playful apology and confessed that she was simply worried about his well-being, though he treated her unexpected surveillance as entirely uncalled for. She stood before him in the quiet street, unabashedly owning up to her role as his self-appointed shadow. Earnestly pleading with him, she warned that he should never be left alone, expressing intense distrust toward the strange woman who had previously intervened. When he asked if she was the one who had contacted Yuruko, she reluctantly confessed that while she disliked the idea, she believed Yuruko was the only one capable of keeping him safe. Beneath his quiet demeanor, however, a striking emptiness remained. Whether interacting with the living or gazing upon the dead, his deep eyes reflected no emotion whatsoever. Rather than being repelled by that chilling detachment, her gaze softened into utter fascination as she found his inner void strangely wonderful. Confused by her sudden admiration, he questioned who she was even talking about, brushing off her intense gaze as nothing more than a weird daydream. As they continued walking down the dark alley, she playfully asked to come up to his room, casually tossing out a wild threat to kill him, leaving him to dismiss her unhinged chatter as total. Broadsheet newspapers display bold headlines detailing the recent string of strange incidents surrounding the town's rumored killer. Scanning the front-page articles outside a newsstand, Shinya quietly reflects on how peaceful the world seems on the surface, though a lingering doubt sits in the back of his mind. As he continues along the sidewalk, a lively companion bounds up alongside him, offering a beaming morning greeting that he answers with a dry response. Together, they make their way down the quiet residential street, where a small crowd of locals and media personnel has begun gathering outside a storefront. Pointing toward the gathering of reporters, she remarks on how far the television crews traveled, but he promptly reminds her that the media circus in town is entirely her fault. Glancing sideways at him with an undeterred smirk, she begins to form a sly, imaginative thought. She begins daydreaming about being interviewed on live television and scouted for stardom, only for him to deliver a swift chop to her head to shatter her delusion. Rubbing her head, she lets out a cheeky giggle, completely unbothered by the scolding while he glares in exasperation. As she continues chuckling, his attention shifts to a mysterious passerby carrying a dark parasol who walks silently past them in the opposite direction. As he continues down the street, a mysterious figure carrying a dark parasol passes right alongside him. Standing amidst the crowd, she turns to glare back at them with a subtle, knowing smirk. With a sharp, intense gaze, she boldly calls out his full name to offer a sharp morning greeting. Walking alongside his companion, he reflects with weary exasperation on the sheer number of troublesome women surrounding his daily life. Looking toward the school ahead, he mentally prepares himself to introduce the remaining figures in his chaotic world. Inside the classroom, a classmate named Hunta gazes quietly out the window as students settle in. Approaching Hunta, he casually requests that his friend inform the teacher that he has slipped off to the infirmary. When another student overhears and questions if he is skipping class, he firmly repeats his destination without hesitation. As a classmate shouts after him asking where he thinks he is going, he enunciates his answer emphatically loud and clear before stepping into the hallway. Moments later, the sliding door opens to reveal the quiet refuge of the school infirmary. He slinks quietly down the school corridor, slipping past a stern teacher focused on her own duties. Peering cautiously through the doorway, he ensures the coast is clear before making his move. Pausing at the entrance, he reflects on Yukoken High's unspoken truth. Within these walls reside both a princess and a demon. Stepping fully into the peaceful infirmary, he finds the room quiet and seemingly deserted. Pulling back the heavy white curtain with a soft swish, his gaze falls upon the secluded bed. Lying motionless on the bed is the slumbering girl, unmistakably one of those two famed figures. Deep in tranquil sleep lies Uchida Yameji, widely known throughout the school as the Sleeping Beauty. Standing over her in complete silence, he slowly reaches out a hand toward the sleeping girl. Leaning down directly over her face, he quietly calls out her name, Yameji. Her eyelids slowly flutter open with a faint exhale, her groggy gaze locking onto him as she awakens. She slowly opened her eyes and softly greeted her visitor, taking in the sight of him standing beside her bed. Sitting up with a long, comfortable stretch, she let out a gentle yawn while he looked on, thoroughly unimpressed. Feeling completely refreshed, she cheerfully mentioned how well she had rested, leaving him flabbergasted given how much trouble he had gone through to tend to her. Expressing her gratitude with a bright smile, she handed over a fresh stack of newspapers. Taking the papers, he suggested that if she felt guilty about bothering him, she should simply buy a mobile phone. She quietly apologized, clutching her reading material. Peering over her papers, she confessed her aversion to modern electronics, even as he considered her strange routine of spending the majority of every day asleep. Her condition was no mere habit. She was bound by an inexplicable slumber that constantly pulled her away from consciousness. Born with this severe affliction, she could drop into endless slumbers that stretched on for days without interruption. Confined mostly to the infirmary bed, she nevertheless strove to attend school as best she could, becoming a familiar sight to both students and faculty. Content in her quiet sanctuary, she hummed happily while flipping through her papers, earning her the title of the Academy's Sleeping Beauty. She quietly schemes through the printed news pages spread across her bed, murmuring in mild interest as her fingers trace the fresh ink. Surprised by recent headlines, she remarks on how frequently high-ranking officials change, to which he simply concurs while watching her absorb the news. Following global developments from afar remains her sole true pastime, an earnest attempt to stay connected to world affairs that bear no direct impact on her secluded existence. Recently, however, a local grim subject caught her attention: the elusive serial murderer known as Kisaragi Town's Phantom Killer. She considers the killer's sensationalized moniker utterly disgraceful, appealing to him as a fellow resident who agrees with her quiet indignation. Puzzled by the investigation's failure to catch a perpetrator with 6 victims, she analyzes the chaotic crime scenes, questioning whether law enforcement lacks crucial intelligence or strategy. Suddenly leaning right up into his face, she urgently demands his opinion on the mystery, catching him entirely off guard as he stammers out a noncommittal response. Realizing he must depart, she softly asks if he might linger a while longer, but he gently declines with an apologetic gesture. Accepting his departure, she sheepishly requests their customary farewell ritual, prompting him to softly place a comforting hand atop her head and bid her good night, sending her into a peaceful rest. With a quiet slide of the doorway, he steps out into the hall, leaving her behind as she gently drifts back into deep slumber. He is suddenly ambushed from above as a shadowy figure leaps out from a doorway, sharp claws extended and glowing eyes fixed intently upon him. Despite the sudden strike, he remains unbothered with a deadpan expression while eerie dragging sounds echo right behind him. The doors abruptly slam shut with a heavy clatter, sealing the hallway exit and trapping them inside the secluded room. Giggling softly in the dim space, the assailant grabs hold of his uniform collar to restrain him completely. The attacker reveals herself as Akane, laughing wildly while clamping her hand over his mouth and declaring that she has been waiting for him. With sharp fangs exposed and eyes wide with excitement, she demands to drink his blood, confirming that she is a literal vampire. This fact is no exaggeration or figurative figure of speech. Her monstrous nature is absolute truth. She possesses all the physical traits of a true nightwalker: skin as cold and pale as death, acute vulnerability to sunlight that forces her to carry a parasol, and crimson eyes that cut through the dark. Crucially, her appetite is terrifyingly genuine, as she actively attacks real humans to feed on their fresh blood. Her predatory urges have stirred up serious trouble at school on multiple occasions, having repeatedly lunged at unsuspecting classmates to bite into their necks. She stood silently, a dark figure driven by mysterious motives. Was she truly on the verge of starving without blood, or merely playing a dangerous game? Regardless of the reason, the fundamental question remained whether there was ever a valid justification to feed on another human being. Throwing herself at Shinya, she latched onto his collar with desperate force. He struggled against her grip, shouting for her to stop clinging to him while she insisted that she already understood. Panting heavily with a wide, frantic grin, the vampire leaned dangerously close to his face, her voice rising in eager anticipation as she urged him to hurry. Shinya managed to shove her back against the wire fence, but she continued to complain, protesting that it had been far too long since they last met, and that she could no longer endure the intense hunger. Rather than continuing to fight her off, Shinya reached into his pocket and pulled out a small utility knife, extending the blade while keeping the desperate girl at arm's length. Seeing the sharp blade, she gasped in alarm and asked if he intended to kill someone, wondering why he was carrying such a weapon. Shinya casually rolled up his sleeve and dismissed her silly assumption, remarking on how foolish it was to automatically equate carrying a blade with being a murderer. Holding the utility knife poised over his exposed arm, he paused for a brief moment before posing a quiet question of his own. Shinya reflected on how, for someone like Akane, blood was simple. It either tasted good or bad, and it had become abundantly clear that his blood fell into the former category. Latching onto his bleeding arm, she greedily drank from his wrist, letting out soft, satisfied gasps as her intense thirst was finally quenched. Unbeknownst to either of them in the heat of the moment, a dark figure lurked near the doorway, quietly observing the disturbing transaction from the shadows. Suddenly, the shadow lurking in the doorway burst into the room, drawing a pair of sharp scissors as she made a decisive move toward the intruder. The sudden interruption startled the young man, who instantly recognized his quiet classmate. She brandished her improvised weapon without hesitation, coldly declaring that anyone who dared to make her lord bleed deserved death. Her dramatic accusation immediately drew a furious response from the small vampire. Her rage boiled over at the insult, her sharp fangs bared as she snarled back an aggressive threat at her sudden challenger. Seeing her on the verge of pouncing, he stepped between them, extending a hand to break up the quarrel and asking why his self-appointed servant had appeared. He immediately saw through her excuse, calling out her lie and guessing that his maid had summoned her again. Striking a noble pose with her scissors, she insisted that as a knight, she was bound to answer the call of his heart whenever rescue was needed. She kept her scissors leveled at her rival, commanding the specter to stand back lest her impurity stain her master, while the baffled vampire yelled at him to explain who this strange girl was. The standoff instantly devolved into a chaotic brawl, forcing him to physically restrain the wildly thrashing vampire, as both girls hurled wild threats of murder and banishment at each other. He stood in deadpan exhaustion, enduring the relentless barrage of shouting as the furious creature threatened to bite her opponent to death. He quickly offered a bargain to restore peace, promising to let the vampire feed on his blood after school on the condition that she cease her rampage and leave them alone. He then gestured toward his solemn companion and flatly dismissed her from the room, leaving the knight bewildered by his sudden command while the vampire looked on with a glare. He could only watch as Akane spat out a final threat to kill Yuruko later, calling her a lowlife before storming away while Yuruko pleaded for her to stop. Once the argument subsided and the door slammed shut behind them, he let out a long, weary sigh, adjusting his sleeves to regain his composure. Seeking to clear things up, he walked over to one of the restroom stalls and knocked on the door, only for a playful voice from inside to announce that it was occupied. Undeterred, he pressed on, asking Tuka why she was slacking off instead of attending her class. From inside the stall, she merely hummed with a sly, knowing smirk, dodging his question entirely. Instead of explaining herself, she cheerfully reminded him of a glaring problem. He was standing right inside the girl's bathroom. Overcome with sudden embarrassment, he bowed profusely and offered a hasty apology before preparing to flee, while she nonchalantly told him it was fine. Drifting in a dark void of sleep, Shinya heard a faint, persistent voice calling out to him again and again. As the distant voice urged him to wake up, he slowly recognized that it was his younger sister calling for his return to consciousness. Promising her that he would stir in just a moment, he was suddenly met with a startling ultimatum. If he did not wake up immediately, she would kiss him. Snapping his eyes open in disbelief, he barely had time to process her threat before she leaned down and pressed her lips forcefully onto his in a sudden, deep kiss. She held him pinned beneath her on the bed, prolonging the overwhelming kiss without giving him any chance to pull away. Finally breaking contact, she pulled back with a cheeky, satisfied grin and cheerfully wished her older brother a good morning. Overcome by shock and panic, he instinctively shoved her off with both hands, shouting out as he threw her backward. The force of his desperate push sent her tumbling right out of his bedroom doorway and hurtling into the hallway. Crashing near the bottom step, she sat dazed and gargling in pain, muttering about how harsh his rejection had been. She sat comfortably at the small table, proudly presenting the fresh breakfast she had just prepared for him, while lecturing him about the lack of real food in his refrigerator. Groggy and overwhelmed, he could only offer tired protests as he quietly sipped his drink. Continuing her relentless caretaking, she thrust another dish toward him, insisting he eat that as well. As her chatter filled the room, he couldn't help but stare blankly at his energetic younger sister, Mai-Mei. Despite her demanding and vocal nature, he held a deep affection for her, firmly believing that regardless of what anyone else might say, she was undeniably the sweetest little sister in the world. Her attention suddenly shifted away from the meal as she reached down to pick up his mobile phone, prompting him to glance over and make sure it was indeed his device in her hands. Turning the glowing screen directly toward him, she fixed him with an intense, suspicious gaze and immediately demanded an explanation about an unfamiliar contact number. He calmly explained that it belonged to a delivery driver who had called prior to dropping off a package, but she remained unconvinced and decided to delete the contact anyway, just to be completely safe. This intense territorial behavior was nothing new to him, as she strictly forbade him from making any friends of the opposite sex. In fact, her possessiveness had once been so extreme that she wouldn't even allow him to make male friends until he had practically begged her through tears to reconsider. The only rare exceptions she had ever granted were for long-standing childhood acquaintances like Satsuki, whom she begrudgingly allowed into his life as a special case. Watching her navigate through his phone, he smiled with fond resignation, accepting that she was simply his hopelessly possessive and spoiled little sister. He watched in disbelief as she cheerily announced that she had accidentally deleted another contact from his phone, casually brushing off her sabotage with a hummed tune. In response to her brazen interference, he delivered a sharp chop to her head, leaving her nursing a small bump while grumbling about the hassle of re-entering the contact. As she smoothed down her hair, her eyes narrowed with quiet suspicion, asking if he held feelings for Satsuki, to which he plainly answered that he simply liked her as a friend. That answer failed to satisfy her possessive heart, prompting her to press into his chest with an intense glare and demand to know if he cared for this friend more than her. Softening his expression, he gently rested a hand atop her head, reassuring her that there was no comparison to be made because he cherished her. Hearing his gentle affirmation, her dark eyes sparkled as a warm flush spread across her cheeks, and she sweetly confessed her affection back to him. The quiet warmth between the siblings soon gave way to the mundane rhythm of a new day at school, where light banter echoed under the open sky. As students gathered near the school grounds, the atmosphere brimmed with daily chatter and the subtle tension of familiar faces crossing paths. Nearby in the hallway, the energetic girl in the tracksuit threw a small object with a playful shout, breaking the usual decorum of the corridor. Meanwhile, in a quiet spot, the elegant Tuka leaned dramatically close over him with a playful giggle, completely catching him off guard. She giggled softly, declaring with mischievous delight that the two of them were finally completely alone together. As she pressed her weight heavily against him, Shinya grumbled and asked what she was planning, urging her to back off. She merely laughed off his protest, insisting that her extra weight was simply proof of her love. Switching tactics, she casually asked if he had kissed May earlier that morning. He turned pale in instant shock, demanding to know how she could possibly know such a thing, while she teased him mercilessly about his terrified expression. Slumping against the wall, he defeatedly admitted that May had indeed kissed him. Unfazed, she leaned in dangerously close, asking if he understood what that implied for her. She went on to explain that she was not just some stereotypical psychotic stalker heroine that could be found anywhere. He retorted in annoyance that he had no interest in her bizarre archetypes. Continuing her bizarre monologue, she claimed she was far too tolerant to ever utter cliché lines demanding exclusive devotion, leaving him staring at her with deadpan disbelief. Immediately contradicting her claim of high tolerance, she burst into a comical fit of fury, weeping loudly about how utterly envious she was of May stealing a kiss. Suddenly dropping the tantrums, she pounced straight toward his lips to claim her own kiss, sending him into a panic as he tried to fend off her advance. Before her lips could reach him, a sharp blade flashed into the air, stopping just inches from her throat as Yumeji coldly ordered her to unhand him. Glaring with murderous intensity, the dark-haired girl scoffed at the concept of tolerance, confronting her rival with lethal malice. She kept her sharp blade poised at her rival's throat, but the targeted girl merely smirked in response, casually remarking that she had not even summoned her this time. Demanding to know how anyone could enter through locked doors and windows, the intruder was met only with a harsh click of the tongue and an uncompromising order to step aside. As the weapon was lowered, the blonde beauty dramatized the rescue, teasingly likening her dark-haired savior to a noble knight or a stealthy ninja, while the boy urged them to hurry. Turning her attention back to him, she fussed over his safety, relieved when he offered a tired sigh and confirmed he was completely unharmed. He openly praised his quiet protector for resisting the corrupting influence of their unwanted guest, provoking an immediate shout of indignation over being called a haunting spirit. Standing motionless between them, the quiet girl stared blankly ahead, completely overwhelmed by the rare sensation of receiving genuine praise. Noticing her subtle internal joy, the blonde girl pointed it out with playful banter, teasing how adorable her reaction was while he looked on in total confusion. Striking a dramatic pose, she playfully summarized the lesson for the day, warning him that young women were prone to intense jealousy and casually threatening to beat him up. Spinning the threat right back around, he solemnly repeated her exact words to her face, prompting an annoyed outburst over him copying her phrasing twice. Dismissing the banter, she composed herself and urged him to head back with her, suggesting they simply leave the lingering nuisance behind. She was quickly swept up in another round of intense bickering, exchanging sharp retorts with the others over who was truly haunting whom while defending their respective motives. Taking advantage of the commotion, he quietly slipped away, sprinting through the school hallway while the group realized too late that he had fled. He finally reached the stairwell, leaning against the wall and gasping for air as he tried to put some distance between himself and the chaotic crowd. Exhausted by the endless drama, he muttered a complaint about how troublesome everything had become, completely unaware that someone was lurking in the shadows right behind him. As he paused, a spectacled girl stepped out from behind him, nervously explaining that she had chased after him to discuss some personal business. He instantly slammed his fist into the wall beside her, harshly reminding her never to speak to him at school, yet his harsh treatment only seemed to bring her strange delight. Timidly clearing her throat, she brought up a promise they had made for the following day, asking if they could postpone it because something unexpected had arisen. Annoyed by such a trivial request, he delivered a forceful kick to her body, shouting that she could have easily sent a text message instead of confronting him in person. While she crumpled onto the floor, profusely apologizing and thanking him for the blow, he coolly admitted that he was fully aware a text would have sufficed, but simply wanted an excuse to kick her. Her submission reached a disturbing new peak when she suddenly began licking his footwear in pure ecstasy, causing him to cry out in sheer disgust for her to stop. He sat alone on the stairwell, weighed down by the constant struggle of balancing his daily life with the overwhelming demands imposed upon him. The thought of upsetting May filled him with dread, yet complying with her extreme possessiveness brought its own set of frustrating complications. Pondering the true nature of her intense behavior, he wondered if her actions stemmed from pure jealousy or a much deeper, unyielding need for control over his life. As he stood contemplating at the foot of the stairs, questions raced through his mind regarding what exact threat May was so desperately trying to protect him from, and who she truly feared. His solitary musings were abruptly cut short when Akane leaned over the railing above, sporting a sharp, predatory grin as she gleefully announced that she had finally found him. She immediately demanded that he accompany her on a shopping trip right then and there to carry her bags, callously dismissing his concerns about skipping their remaining afternoon classes. Though annoyed by her overbearing and cocky attitude, he reluctantly gave in to her demands, agreeing to tag along just to end the argument, which brought a triumphant smile to her face. He suddenly halted, pointing out a girl lying motionless on the floor nearby, but Akane completely brushed it off, claiming he was merely hallucinating to keep them moving. Leaving the incident behind, the two of them walked through town together, with him dutifully lugging her heavy shopping bags while she casually strolled ahead under her umbrella. The afternoon sun gradually gave way to twilight, casting long shadows across the evening sky as their outing came to an end. He finally arrived at his apartment building, ascending the exterior stairs and sliding his key into the front door lock, pausing as a subtle detail caught his attention just before turning the bolt. He carefully pushed the door open, peering inside the dimly lit apartment in complete silence. Stepping past the entryway, his eyes fell upon a familiar pair of shoes on the floor, prompting him to call out his sister's name into the quiet space. As he ventured further into the room, he was met with total disarray. Clothes tossed haphazardly and paper fragments scattered all over the floorboards. In the middle of the destruction sat May, kneeling quietly amidst the debris on the wooden floor with her head bowed low. Concerned by the unsettling sight, he nervously asked if something terrible had taken place. Without looking up, she softly welcomed him home and explained that she had come over to cook him dinner, while he thanked her gently while pointing out the extraordinary mess. She indicated the telephone recording unit on the floor, mentioning that a message had arrived for him, which shocked him as a hesitant voice belonging to Shikimura began to play. The recording continued as the girl apologized on tape for obtaining his phone number from the class roster before bringing up their prior conversation. As the voicemail revealed that she suddenly had free time for the following day, a cold sweat broke out across his face while May sat motionless beside him. When the message concluded with a proposal to go through with their promise, he internally panicked and cursed the girl's terrible timing, fully aware of the dangerous mood brewing in the room. He quickly attempted to defuse the situation, firmly denying that the caller was his girlfriend and insisting she was barely an acquaintance. Before he could finish his explanation, she tackled him to the ground in a desperate outburst of denial. Clinging to him with frantic intensity, she sobbed hysterically, screaming at him never to look at or speak to anyone else, obsessively repeating that her older brother belonged solely to her. As her cries subsided into quiet whimpers, he gently placed a hand near her, softly calling her name to calm her spiraling emotion. Looking down at her tight grip on his clothes, he silently questioned why his younger sister depended on him so obsessively, wishing she could find independence instead of anchoring her entire world to him. Meeting her tear-filled gaze among the wreckage of the room, he spoke her name once more with quiet resignation. He offered her a gentle promise, reassuring her that he wasn't going anywhere and would always remain her brother, which finally brought a glimmer of relief to her eyes. Yet despite his reassuring words, his resolve hardened regarding the one who had triggered this crisis, leading him to severely beat Masami the very next day. Throughout the afternoon, a boy went about his normal routine, walking through the quiet corridors of the school campus. He maintained an indifferent expression, glancing quietly to the side as he passed between classrooms without attracting any unwanted attention. Surrounded by fellow students chatting casually near the courtyard windows, his daily life appeared entirely ordinary and peaceful. Yet far from his knowledge, sharp keystrokes echoed through a dimly lit room while a spoon scooped into a sweet dessert. Savoring a bite, she sat before a brightly glowing monitor, systematically clicking through hundreds of candid photographs organized into dedicated digital archives. Alone in the quiet solitude of her apartment late into the night, she hummed happily while surrounded by her elaborate computer setup. She cheerfully recorded her nightly log, delighting in sorting through her massive secret gallery of photographs taken without his knowledge. Her obsession went far beyond casual distance shots, featuring intimate, hidden angles taken directly inside his private bedroom. Meanwhile, the target of her overwhelming affection sat alone on his bed, completely oblivious to the hidden eyes watching his every move. While he remained completely oblivious, Tuka gleefully listened in on her continuous audio feeds, reveling in the secret access she maintained. She fondly recalled their ongoing tug-of-war, explaining how she would constantly plant wiretaps and surveillance devices only for him to discover and dismantle them in an endless battle of wits. Beaming with proud satisfaction, she boasted that she had made significant progress, as he now only remembered to inspect his room every few months. And even then, she always replaced the devices the very next day. Her surveillance extended far beyond his bedroom, as she had meticulously bugged his desk, chair, bag, and shoe locker at school to ensure no moment went unmonitored. Every path he took, every destination he visited, and every hallway he traversed was thoroughly covered by her extensive network. Admiring her own thoroughness from her desk, she mused aloud whether her intense obsession simply made her a perfectionist. She then revealed that her collection was not limited to digital media, gesturing toward a used spoon and a crumpled towel kept in her room. Licking the stolen spoon while holding an ice cream tub, she shamelessly confessed that every single item had been taken directly from his room. Savoring the taste with a blissful blush, she squealed in delight at the pleasure of using his utensil. Swooning further, she admitted that she regularly stole his gym jersey to indulge her desires before secretly replacing it with an identical new one. Pressing the headphones tightly against her ears, she squeals in sheer delight as the faint sound of his voice filters through the audio monitor. As she listens even closer, she catches him humming a tune to himself while stepping into his room, completely butchering the lyrics. Unable to contain her amusement, she buries her face into her desk and stifles a burst of giggles at his terrible memory for song lyrics. Resting her head against her arms, her expression softens with affection as she gushes over how cute he is, overwhelmed by her deep obsession with every detail of his life. Her cheeks flush a deep crimson as the thought of him consumes her entirely, repeating like an endless echo in her mind. With wide, impassioned eyes, she silently declares her absolute, unfiltered love for everything about him. Suddenly, the faint sound of a door creaking open in his house interrupts her thoughts, catching her attention through the headset. Realizing that he is stepping out of his home, she bolts upright in her chair. In a flurry of panic, she frantically snatches her coat and struggles to put it on so she won't lose track of him. Slipping out into the cool night, she begins her stealthy pursuit under the starry sky. She stepped out into the dark night, pausing under the glow of the streetlights as she tried to guess where he might have gone, suspecting he was bound for the Akinosaka district. Reflecting on his routine, she knew he was a true creature of the night, accustomed to wandering aimlessly through the quiet town after dark. The dark streets hid strange occurrences, where girls in their orbit often found themselves bound or caught in bizarre, perilous encounters. Pausing near a line of vending machines, she whispered a quiet apology into the stillness, wondering if anyone had witnessed the unsettling sights lurking in the shadows. With a disappointed sigh, she leaned back against the wall, acknowledging that if he was genuinely trying to melt into the night, finding him would be virtually impossible. Looking up at the open sky, she felt longing overwhelm her, desperately aching to see him at that very moment. Suddenly, the cold, sharp edge of a knife pressed firmly against her ribs from behind. He materialized out of the dark right behind her, softly uttering the word stab as he pressed the blade into her side. Fixing her with an intense, unblinking glare, he declared with chilling calm that she had already been pierced. A deep blush spread across her cheeks as she smiled in swooning delight, teasingly asking if he meant an arrow straight to her heart. She recoiled with exaggerated alarm, teasingly accusing him of holding a dangerous weapon and half-jokingly questioning if he had actually murdered someone. Scoffing at her wild accusation, he casually twirled what was merely a toy blade in his hand, complaining about how quickly women jumped to prejudiced conclusions. As they bantered, a quiet figure emerged from the shadows behind them, staring coldly after having witnessed his earlier encounter with another woman. He looked back in disbelief at the harsh label bestowed upon his companion, while she smugly celebrated the unexpected endorsement as proof of her moral purity. Surprised by her sudden presence, he questioned when she had arrived, only to realize she had been silently monitoring his every move from the start. Turning to her fellow watcher with a sharp wink, she playfully called her out for withholding information about his location despite their prior arrangement. She simply turned her head away in silent frustration, unwilling to engage in further petty squabbling. Gritting her teeth in annoyance, the maid girl glared back, while her quiet rival internally conceded defeat regarding the girl's uncanny ability to corner their mutual target. Looking up toward the night sky with an aloof expression, he remained oblivious to her silent, aching desire to be the first in everything regarding him. Noting the faint, lingering softness in her gaze, he asked why she was wearing such a strange expression, to which she gently replied that it was nothing at all. She quietly matched her pace to his as they walked side by side down the open street, her gentle smile remaining intact. Sitting alone at a desk in a stark, sterile room beneath a long ceiling light, Shinya began to speak, reflecting quietly on recent events. As a metronome ticked steadily on the desk beside him, he reiterated his point, emphasizing that what had transpired was far simpler than it appeared. He insisted firmly that the entire outcome had been nothing more than a sheer coincidence. Waving his hand dismissively, he explained that expecting him to have mapped out every detail was ridiculous, arguing that as long as things turned out fine in the end, the process hardly mattered. He doubled down on his claim, declaring the turn of events completely and undeniably accidental. But a voice from across the table suddenly cut in to question his sincerity. Leaning forward over the desk with a playful, knowing smirk, Tuka rested her head near the ticking pendulum and asked if it truly had been just a coincidence. In response to her skepticism, he narrowed his eyes suspiciously, asking what reason she had to doubt his word as the metronome swung back with a sharp click. Moving beyond their conversation, the focus shifted outdoors to a quiet town street lined with parked cars, signaling the start of a new investigation titled The Case of Suzuki Tamahito. A sleek sedan glides smoothly along the open road under the bright morning sun. Inside, a sharp young man sits at the wheel, navigating his morning commute in quiet concentration. His dark eyes remain composed and focused on the road ahead. Moments later, the vehicle pulls into the parking lot beside a tall school building, its tires coming to a gentle halt. Stepping out with his briefcase in hand, he hears a voice greeting him as Suzuki-sensei. Turning around with a warm, pleasant smile, he cheerfully returns the morning greeting. As he walks through the courtyard, students greet him warmly from every direction, and he politely acknowledges each one. Continuing through the main hall, his footsteps echo along the spacious corridors of the institution. Entering the faculty office, fellow teachers note how early he has arrived, to which he calmly explains that traffic was light today. Settling into the busy workspace, he establishes his role as a full-time educator here at Juka Girls High School. He found himself cornered by inquisitive colleagues in the faculty room, all asking how he had handled the previous day's difficult situation regarding a student's guardian. With a calm demeanor, he admitted that while it had been a tough ordeal, he had managed to get through it somehow. Looking down at his open hand, he reflected on the nature of his daily environment, considering it completely ordinary despite the occasional hardship. The quiet clutter of the office seemed to reinforce his thoughts. While teaching might carry a modest sense of significance, it was hardly anything extraordinary in the grand scheme of things. As the chime reverberated through the hallway signaling the next period, he stepped out with his lesson materials, navigating past students while musing on how adult responsibilities follow a person wherever they go. Taking his position in front of the chalkboard, he looked out over the attentive classroom, holding fast to his principle that if one must perform a duty, one should at least find a way to enjoy it. He knew all too well that overexerting mind and body would lead to quick exhaustion, particularly when managing teenage girls during their volatile adolescent years. Holding his textbook, he reminded himself to preserve an even keel, neither becoming overly passionate nor falling into despondency, nor speaking with unnecessary harshness. He maintained that exercising steady control over work, hobbies, and indecision alike allowed a person to navigate life far more smoothly. Adjusting his gaze, he defined his personal core ethos above all else: to systematically avoid trouble, accepting himself simply as an ordinary man named Suzuki Tamahito, who shared the common desires and thoughts of humanity. Standing at the front of the classroom, he silently observed the row of students before him, fully committed to preserving his quiet, uncomplicated life. He kept a steady gaze over the classroom, watching as students like May rested quietly at their desks, listening to his lesson as the period neared its end. Behind his glasses, his eyes narrowed thoughtfully, taking in every subtle reaction from the young minds seated before him. As the chime of the school bell echoed through the room, he realized with mild chagrin that he had run out of time before reaching his planned punchline, prompting a chorus of groans and chatter from the students. Despite their loud complaints about his lectures always dragging on unnecessarily, without even being on the upcoming test, he secretly maintained a quiet pride in knowing how deeply attached his students truly were to his presence. Turning away from the lectern, he gathered his things while the young girl watched him closely, preparing to follow him out into the corridor. As they walked together down the brightly lit hallway, he reflected contentedly on the peaceful predictability of his days, fully satisfied with a tranquil routine that was neither exceptional nor unacceptable. All around them, students gathered in casual pairs along the hallway windows, leaving him to wonder if anyone could truly find cause for dissatisfaction within such an undisturbed life. The steady rhythm of footsteps against the linoleum floor emphasized the calm uniformity of school life unfolding uninterrupted. Pausing near the stairwell, his attention was suddenly caught by two figures standing together on the landing below, breaking the quiet atmosphere. Approaching them with concern, he asked what was wrong, noticing the tense mood between the adult staff member and the troubled young student who turned toward him as he spoke. He gently inquired if her distress was regarding the recent incident, to which the tearful student quietly confirmed his fears. The distraught girl explained that she had spoken with her friend's mother that morning, revealing that Yasu-chan still had not returned home nor made any contact. Listening intently beside his colleague, he noted with growing concern that an entire week had already passed without a word. Although he expressed a desire to help, the student softly reassured him that the tragic situation was not his fault. Beneath his composed exterior, dark thoughts of the recent spate of missing youths began to surface. As the young girl wiped away her tears over her best friend's sudden disappearance, common assumptions about runaway children provided a convenient cover. Looking upon her quiet grief, an icy detachment masked his thoughts regarding her futile worrying. He knew with absolute, chilling certainty that she would never see Ishimaru Yasuna ever again. For deep beneath the earth, he had already buried the missing girl. Turning away into shadow, his sinister secret remained buried alongside his victim. He harbors a dark, twisted secret, reflecting on how inflicting violence upon women gives him an unmatched thrill, having already claimed 3 innocent lives. With a cold, sadistic grin, his mind revels in the monstrous desires that drive his double life. He vividly envisions the suffering of his powerless victims, deriving a twisted satisfaction from inflicting as much pain as possible before stealing their lives. A cold sweat glistening on his face, his darkened eyes betray an insatiable compulsion that he cannot control. Watching the memory of a body buried under the cover of darkness, He dismissively ponders how society would brand him as the lowest form of scum if his atrocities were ever exposed. In his deeply warped rationale, he convinces himself that his craving for a peaceful life and his monstrous crimes are not contradictory. Believing that both the benevolent teacher and the depraved killer are essential to his existence, he smoothly transitions back to reality as a student calls out her gratitude. Wearing a gentle mask of empathy, he apologizes softly to the distressed girl, expressing sorrow over his inability to help locate her missing friend. Turning to look back as he walks down the school hallway, he bids them a pleasant farewell while the unsuspecting students wave goodbye. His dark gaze fixates on May Maitain as she passes by, calmly marking his own student as his next intended victim. She remained completely oblivious inside the classroom, her expression unwittingly stoking the predatory desires of the teacher watching her from afar as he mused about taking her soon. Knowing he had to exercise restraint, he retreated to his car, reminding himself that patience was key and that he should take his time just as he always had. His dark eyes narrowed in quiet determination, firmly resolving that her fate was sealed for a future day. With his decision firmly settled, his car glided away smoothly into the urban landscape, leaving the school grounds behind. Meanwhile, near a vending machine outside, Tuka stood holding a warm canned drink, taking a quiet sip as she gazed off into the distance. She paused silently in the cool air, her eyes lingering thoughtfully on the surrounding neighborhood without uttering a word. Later that evening, Suzuki arrived back at his apartment complex, stepping quietly through the main entrance toward his unit. Unlocking his front door, he stepped into his entryway and noticed several letters resting in his door slot. Gathering them up as he entered, sorting through the stack of envelopes, his calm demeanor remained steady until one particular envelope caught his eye. Tearing open the mysterious letter, his eyes suddenly widened in utter shock and alarm at the unexpected contents inside. He stared in sheer disbelief at the photograph enclosed in the envelope, instantly recognizing the smiling girl as Ishimara Yasuna. Shocked by the revelation, he whipped his head around, cold sweat beading on his forehead as an unsettling tension filled the air. Standing alone in the stark hallway, he clutched the paper tightly, acutely aware that his calculated plan to target May had been compromised. Standing against the silhouette of the city, Suzuki-sensei paused along the quiet sidewalk, taking in his surroundings. Noticing a familiar figure standing nearby near the edge of the street, he called out to young Maitain. Turning to face her teacher, she greeted him politely while he inquired what she was doing standing all by herself along the road. Following the direction of her quiet gaze, he looked down at the pavement to see a small creature lying crushed in the street. Observing the tragic sight, he expressed a gentle sympathy, noting that a passing vehicle had likely struck the poor animal. When he pressed further and asked why she had been staring at it so intently, she brushed it off casually, claiming she was just looking for no particular reason. Glancing downward with dark, unreadable eyes, she quietly admitted that her only thought was simply that it was dead. Her stark, emotionless realization left a chilling silence suspended between them in the bright afternoon air. She continued on her way along the elevated stone embankment, leaving behind the quiet roadside. Away from the street, a heavy silence settled over a dimly lit, enclosed room. Seated alone on a sofa in the shadows, Suzuki leaned forward with his head bowed and hands tightly clasped. Resting on the glass table before him were several photographs scattered about. The images showed 3 high school girls, Sakishima Hitomi, Miyamoto Yoshino, and Ishimara Yasuna. Gazing at the faces, the teacher harbored a dark, haunting secret. Every single one of those 3 girls had been murdered by his own hands. Paranoia gripped him as his mind raced with questions, terrified of who could know his crime, how they found out, and what they intended to do with that knowledge. Exhaling a long, weary breath, he closed his eyes briefly and tried to force himself to stay calm. Turning his attention back to the evidence, he began to analyze the threat, reasoning that whoever was targeting him, it was certainly not the police. Yet without any solid clues, he remained trapped in uncertainty, left to wonder what possible motive his mysterious blackmailer could have. He sat contemplating the situation, reasoning that an extortion attempt would typically demand money, yet no clear motives or conditions had been stated. Inspecting the envelope once more, he peered inside only to find photographs and no accompanying letter or demand. Overwhelmed by frustration at the mystery, he angrily tossed the photographs across the coffee table with a bitter curse. Moments later, he leaned forward and carefully retrieved one of the scattered pictures to examine it further. Studying the image closely, he pointed at the face of a fourth girl, realizing this specific portrait held the single clue to breaking his tormentor's hold. As he stared at her features, a crucial detail became clear. He had never met this woman, nor had he been the one to take her life. A faint, sinister smirk crossed his face as he realized his unknown enemy had made a misstep, revealing that their knowledge of his crimes was not as absolute as they wished him to believe. Even so, the shadow of uncertainty remained, and he slumped in his seat, fully aware that the upper hand still belonged to his blackmailer. Paralyzed by endless possibilities, he endlessly weighed his choices, debating whether to launch his own investigation, check his hidden lair, or simply wait for the perpetrator to make the next move. Clenching his trembling hands in helpless fury, he found himself trapped in his own paranoia, unable to act or move forward with his deadly urges. His eyes narrowed into a sharp, calculating stare as he pondered the true motive behind the mysterious threat. He questioned whether this disturbing message was simply a direct warning commanding him to stop killing women. Yet, across town, a completely different concern began to brew as word spread regarding May's suspicious companion. Lounging on the couch in his room, Shinya pressed his ally for details, demanding to know the identity of the man his sister had been seen with. Perched casually on an office chair with a drink, Akane admitted she did not know his name, though she distinctly remembered watching them walk together under umbrellas in the rain. She added that his face was engraved in her memory, having spotted him around multiple times before. Leaning in closer with a sharp grin, she assured him there was no doubt about the man's vile nature, labeling him an utter and complete deviant. Swirling the liquid in her glass, she casually dropped a chilling truth, explaining that the man gave off the inescapable stench of someone who consumes human flesh. Disturbed by the revelation, he realized he could no longer stand idly by while his sister was in danger, deeply worried about what involvement May could possibly have with a man-eating monster. Sensing his tension, she abruptly invaded his personal space and sniffed his neck playfully, teasingly remarking on how delicious he smelled. She expressed her gratitude to him for sharing the information, leaning in close with a playful demeanor. With a sharp, mischievous grin, she then eagerly asked if she could drink his blood in return. Later, back in his quiet dorm room, he sat alone on the edge of his bed, deeply unsettled by what he had learned. Resting his arms in contemplation, he deliberated in silence about the best way to protect his sister from harm. Deciding on an immediate plan, he tapped against the wall and called out to Tuka, asking if she could come over right away. In under 10 seconds, frantic footsteps thundered down the hall before she burst through his door, thrilled that he had summoned her for help. Her eyes sparkled with emotional joy as he asked if she could look into the mysterious man Akane had warned him about. Overjoyed that he was finally relying on her, she passionately declared that she would do her absolute best, though he dryly urged her to pipe down. Even as she cheered loudly in excitement, he rested his head on his hand with a weary expression, waiting for her enthusiasm to cool off. Glancing down at his wristwatch, he abruptly told her to cut the nonsense so they could get down to business. He confronted the chilling reality of Suzuki's secret identity, a monster whose sole purpose in life was consuming women, and who warned that no one would be allowed to stand in his way. Remaining composed with his fingers intertwined, he recalled the warning not to act recklessly, balanced against the stark threat of a knife thrust through a sealed envelope. Any pretense of benevolence faded completely from the teacher's expression, twisted into a violent snarl as he openly threatened to murder anyone who crossed him. Facing such terrifying malice, the young man's eyes hardened with fierce determination, silently vowing to protect his sister from the beast looming in the shadows. A small notebook and a few loose sheets of paper lay resting under the warm light of a hanging lamp, ready to unveil the findings of a secret investigation. Sitting across from her with a quiet, unbothered posture, he gave her the floor to present what she had gathered on the 27-year-old teacher working at his sister's school, Tomohito Suzuki. Opening her notebook with a cheerful flair, She shared her suspicion that the teacher might actually be an abnormally dangerous individual, prompting her to monitor his every move. She voiced her personal assessment with complete confidence, declaring that the man was undeniably up to no good, to which he offered a brief, skeptical response. Smiling brightly without a shred of doubt, she reaffirmed her stance, prompting him to flatly summarize that she simply found the teacher suspicious. Leaning in closer with her notes in hand, she revealed a far more sinister detail, claiming that the teacher had actively stalked several young girls. Continuing with a knowing smirk right next to his ear, she teased that the man was essentially a dangerous stalker just like him, bringing up Akane's past words and questioning what he was truly planning. She continued presenting her theoretical observations, causing him to narrow his eyes in contemplation about the implications of the teacher's so-called preliminary investigation before a hunt. Continuing her summary, she pointed out how Suzuki meticulously followed schoolgirls nearly every day after work, noting that his expression bore the unmistakable focus of a true predator tracking prey. She mused that a teacher shouldn't possess so much free time, suspecting he was actively up to no good at that very moment. Raising the stakes, she pressed him to consider an even darker possibility. What if Suzuki wasn't just a stalker, but a violent offender targeting young women indiscriminately? He brushed off her grim theory with a dismissive wave, insisting that as long as his younger sister remained safe, Suzuki's true nature mattered little to him, though she was already pulling out her next piece of evidence. She leaned uncomfortably close to him as she spread various papers and photographs across the table, prompting him to grumble about her lack of personal space while she explained her search for potential victims. When he asked if she had uncovered any concrete evidence of foul play, she admitted her uncertainty, explaining that her search had only yielded a list of individuals who could potentially be targets. Recounting her process, she described sifting through missing persons records from the past 4 to 5 years to see if any unresolved disappearances matched his preferred profile or geographic area, though that line of inquiry had come up empty. She went on to explain how she had questioned various acquaintances, eventually identifying several missing girls whose friends insisted would never have run away from home on their own accord. Narrowing down her findings, she produced 3 specific photographs from her file and laid them out on the table before him. She singled out one particular photo, identifying a girl named Yasuna Ishimaru as Suzuki's current target, leaving him staring down at the portrait in silent concentration. He listened quietly as Tuko apologized for not gathering sufficient information, offering a mild reassurance that her efforts had still been helpful despite her protestations against his subtle physical touch. As they examined the documents spread out before them, Tuko revealed an additional finding. Teacher Suzuki had not limited his stalking to Yasuna Ishimaru, but had routinely shadowed several other female students as well. She explained that ever since summer break began, Suzuki had obsessively tracked multiple girls, prompting him to deduce that Ishimaru was merely his primary target among a wider pool of candidates. Connecting the timeline in his mind, he realized with growing apprehension that Suzuki had specifically targeted one other girl on a single, isolated occasion. A grim certainty took hold of him as he uttered his sister May's name. Disrupting the heavy atmosphere, Tuka cheerily handed him a piece of paper, prompting his indignation when he realized she was presenting a bill to charge him for her investigative services. Shortly thereafter, in the silence of the house, the sudden ringing of the landline telephone pierced the air before the receiver was picked up. Holding the receiver to his ear, he froze in shock as the voice on the line delivered a devastating revelation. Suzuki had murdered Yasuna Ishimaru. Memories of the bustling cafe where Suzuki had quietly observed his unsuspecting prey flickered through the gloom. Alone in the shadows, the killer sat in quiet solitude, his dark intent now fully unleashed upon his victims. He took a calm sip from his teacup, lost in quiet contemplation. From across the room, his dark gaze shifted toward a girl sitting alone, watching her every move without a word. Sitting amidst the gentle hum of the cafe, he wondered internally if some dark compulsion had overtaken him during that moment. Looking down at his cup, his thoughts drifted back to the fateful night he had disposed of Yasuna Ishimaru. Under the lonely glow of a street lamp, the dark night stood dead silent around his parked vehicle. Leaning casually against the side of his car, he drew a slow drag from his cigarette, staring quietly into the darkness. Extending an open palm, he observed the faint trail of smoke drifting into the chill night air. Suddenly, the quiet was broken by the sharp sound of a heavy footstep approaching from the shadows. Emerging into the light stood Akane, drenched from head to toe in fresh blood and glaring with wild, unhinged eyes. As she tilted her head and asked if they had met somewhere before, his composure shattered, sending his lit cigarette slipping helplessly from his frozen lips. He stood frozen in place as she closed the distance, stepping close enough to sniff him intently. With blood smeared across her face, she sneered at him, remarking that he stank. She then burst into wild, manic laughter, mocking him while admitting that her own stench of blood was far worse. Cackling maniacally into the quiet night, she turned on her heel and walked away down the empty street. Standing alone near his car, he was too stunned by her sudden appearance to pursue her, deciding instead to push the encounter out of his mind. Later, over a fresh cup of coffee, he questioned why he hadn't killed her right then, realizing her bloody arrival had thrown him completely off balance. With a bitter sigh, he lamented how reality had disrupted his quiet routine, preventing him from fully indulging in his dark obsession. Burying his face in his hands, an unsettling chill ran through him as he sensed an unseen gaze watching his every move. At that moment, Tuka approached his table carrying a lunch tray, softly asking if she could join him. She took a seat right beside him, leaving him silent and tense in her sudden presence. She offers a warm, calm smile while gently holding her teacup with both hands, exuding a tranquil confidence amid the bustle of the cafe. Across the small table, he meets her gaze in silence as a heavy, unspoken tension fills the air between them under the hanging light. Shinya examines a detailed expense sheet handed to him, baffled by listed charges like taxi fares and specialized tracking gear. He questions why he should reimburse these costs, but Suzuki proudly insists that while she funds her own daily stalking of him, this specific assignment is different. She angrily demands to know why her personal funds should be wasted on tracking anyone other than her beloved target, leaving the surrounding onlookers thoroughly bewildered. Offended by his harsh response, she dramatically accuses him of reducing her complex affection to a mere trope, claiming his words genuinely wound her. Sighing at her sudden outburst, he reluctantly agrees to foot the bill, instantly shifting her back to cheerful enthusiasm as she accepts the cash. Looking closely at the final total, he assures her that he will fully compensate her for her troubles. Later that day, he travels across town to the apartment of the quiet, glasses-wearing girl, meeting her outside her front door. Stepping inside her home, a cold glass of ice water is placed onto the low coffee table between them as they take their seats. Looking across at him, she remarks on how unusual it is for him to visit her apartment on his own initiative. She sat nervously across from him in the quiet apartment, clearing her throat to ask why he had suddenly dropped by. In response, he bluntly admitted that he was in immediate need of cash, prompting her to reach for her bag without a second thought to ask how much. After a brief pause to estimate the sum, he asked for roughly 100,000 yen, which sent her off immediately to fetch the cash. Returning a moment later, she placed the money-filled envelope on the table, which he picked up with a quiet expression of gratitude. Observing her unquestioning compliance, he voiced his surprise that she had not even asked for his reason, to which she admitted she had no intention of asking. Flustered and breathing heavily, she confessed her inner existential crisis, wondering if her purpose in life was simply to be used as a personal wallet for him, a reality she seemed strangely resigned to. Taken aback by her extreme reaction, he offered to give her a reward for her troubling favor, instantly catching her off guard. Blushing furiously, she frantically protested that receiving a reward was too much, while simultaneously begging him not to hold anything back. Suddenly leaping up, she slid a sleek tablet across the surface of the table toward him. Leaning in close with overwhelming enthusiasm, she presented her specific request on the screen, leaving him entirely stunned by her sudden eagerness. She looks down with a deflated expression, assuming her request was too much, but he simply stares at her with a deadpan gaze, questioning if she truly wants to proceed with such a strange proposal. Agreeing to her request, he calmly takes a sip from his drink while she sits patiently nearby, waiting for his decision. With a simple word of acceptance, he agrees to her terms, causing her to react with overwhelming gratitude and delight. Though he postpones the request for another time, she eagerly agrees, promising to wait expectantly for their next encounter as she prepares to depart. Left alone once more, he stands quietly under the building overhang, watching the surroundings as the afternoon sun casts long shadows across the pavement. As he walks down the street, Yuruko appears beside a parked vehicle to greet him, acknowledging his arrival with her usual silent devotion. Walking faithfully by his side, she reports that his other follower has safely returned home, fulfilling her duty as his steadfast aide. Musing over his recent choices, he admits to himself that making promises and putting himself in debt to others is out of character, a sentiment she silently reinforces by noting how unusual his recent behavior has been. Amused by her critique, he smirks slightly, questioning whether she truly understands the depths of his true nature. She responds with unwavering resolve, declaring that her sole presence is more than sufficient to serve him, leaving him to silently reflect on her unwavering loyalty as they walk together down the quiet street. In a quiet cafe, a solitary cup of coffee rests on a table, setting a deceptively calm backdrop for an impending psychological clash. Across the booth, the dark-haired man rests his hand near his chin, exuding a sharp, calculating composure despite the tense atmosphere. Opposite him sits Suzuki, her long hair cascading past her shoulders as she maintains a cheerful, innocent front while sipping her drink. Observing her closely, he begins to see through her facade, realizing that her sudden presence is far from accidental. With a cold, sharp glare, he demands to know her identity, but she playfully brushes off his inquiry with a wink and a childish giggle. Noticing his unyielding, grim stare, she quickly tries to play it off as a joke, begging him to drop his intimidating expression. Unmoved by her act, he firmly tells her to stop playing games, pressing her on her true motives and questioning her interference in his affairs. Her demeanor turns dark and playful as she realizes he has deduced her purpose, tauntingly suggesting he should just admit his twisted thrill in taking lives, leaving him to silently fume. Dropping her playful tone, she sternly demands that he drop his act so they can settle matters quickly, yet he maintains his stoic innocence, calmly denying any understanding of her words. He remained silent as Suzuki leaned in close, directly confronting him with the claim that he was responsible for 4 deaths. She paused to ponder her own details, musing aloud whether she had miscalculated the body count or if a specific victim named Shiho Aizawa had been spared. Noticing his subtle micro-reaction to the name, she point-blank declared her guess correct, while he inwardly cursed his momentary slip in composure. Quickly regaining his cool demeanor, the accused man pointed out that if her goal was justice, she would have reported him to the police rather than tracking him down to talk. His eyes narrowed into a cold, piercing glare as he bluntly demanded to know her true motive. In response, she merely offered a playful, knowing smile, questioning whether he was truly unaware of what she wanted. Glancing across the quiet cafe, he followed her subtle visual cue toward a young girl sitting alone nearby. A sudden, ominous realization washed over him as the pieces fell into place. He pressed her directly, asking if she was subtly threatening someone he cared about, like a friend or family member. Her sharp, calculating smirk confirmed his suspicion as she asked if the situation was finally clear to him. She watched in calm silence as the dark-haired man suddenly broke into dry laughter, his mock amusement breaking the tense atmosphere of the cafe as he claimed to understand her ploy. He taunted her by naming a specific girl, offering to strangle her immediately to test if she was the hostage. But the young woman casually dismissed the name, telling him he could do as he pleased with her. Continuing her explanation, she made it clear that she was merely offering a fair warning about the consequences of his suspicious actions, though she noted with disappointment that he was completely failing to understand. He offered a brief, dry apology, yet she remained visibly irritated, frustrated that he showed no signs of abandoning his deadly hobby despite her personal visit to warn him. Laying her terms out plainly, she insisted that he cease his killings altogether, emphasizing that there was one specific girl he was strictly forbidden to harm. As he listened stoically, she left the consequences of his potential disobedience entirely to his imagination with a chillingly playful smile. Narrowing his eyes in analytical glare, the killer broke his silence to ask if she understood why he had ignored her initial warning. A subtle, Dark smirk crossed his lips as he questioned whether she truly viewed him as nothing more than a monster. She counterattacked by pointing out that he clearly believed himself detached from human morality, taking lives without hesitation or guilt, addressing him directly as sensei. Leaning forward with a mockingly confident smile, she tapped her finger against the table's surface, questioning whether his composure was merely a front and if someone who valued freedom could truly bear being locked away. She repeated her warning to the cold-hearted killer, playfully urging him to stop his wicked deeds while boasting that her protector would never allow his actions to slide. As the dark-haired killer questioned the identity of the young girl standing beside her, she casually dismissed any attempt he might make to pry into her own secrets, reiterating her defender's watchful presence. He turned his analytical gaze toward the silent girl in black, who returned his look with a cold, unyielding stare of her own. Left with nothing more to say, he sat quietly with his coffee, while she called out to him one final time before walking away with her companion. Elsewhere in the station, a scattered path of unconscious bodies covered the tiled floor, leaving the two girls standing over the scene as she let out a satisfied sigh for a completed task. Walking together down the busy city street, the younger girl fumed with anger, questioning why she was forced to protect someone she considered a filthy wretch, though her companion merely laughed off the harsh words. Unmoved by the light-hearted reaction, the dark-haired girl asserted that blind obedience could never pass for true loyalty, only to be challenged on whether she intended to disobey their master's direct command. The sharp reminder of his authority brought a momentary lull to their debate, as they continued moving through the crowded public square. Proceeding along a glass walkway, the younger girl admitted that the ultimate choice was not hers to make, prompting her companion to voice her own blunt perspective. Twirling a lock of her wavy light hair between her fingers, she casually confessed her total indifference to their target's fate, asking her partner if she didn't feel the exact same way. She burst into mocking laughter at the suggestion, scoffing at the idea that their master would mourn someone like his supposed little sister. Meanwhile, enraged beyond measure, the target slammed his fist onto the desk in his office, his mind consumed by pure rage as he cursed under his breath. Storming out into the night, he sped off down the highway, the roar of his high-performance car echoing through the dark. Behind the wheel, his eyes burned with lethal intensity as a single, furious thought repeated in his head, refusing to let anyone cross him. Gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, he seethed over how a mere child who understood nothing of the world had dared to threaten him. Staring fixedly at the open road ahead, his resentment deepened as he questioned the audacity of her foolish defiance. Floorboards pressed to the limit. The engine roared louder, mirroring the boiling fury that threatened to consume him entirely. The vehicle sped across the deserted bridge, a lone streak of light cutting through the quiet urban night. He remained focused on the dark asphalt, driving relentlessly toward whatever retribution he was preparing to unleash. Stripping away his clothes in isolation, he embraced the accusation leveled against him, acknowledging that he truly was far from human. He had long since abandoned human morals and ethics, embracing the terrifying realization that even if his chosen path led straight to destruction, he would live and strike as a ruthless beast. Looking out at the oblivious passers-by in the street below, he repeated his menacing vow to prove his true, uninhibited nature. Alongside his knife, a high-voltage stun gun lay ready on the table, a brutal instrument selected to ensure absolute control over his victim. Moments later, the violent assault unfolded in full force, dark blood splattering across the floor around his bare feet. Gripping the sharp blade firmly, he repeatedly plunged it downward with relentless, psychotic. Wiping the sweat and blood from his face, he cast a terrifying smirk downward, declaring with sadistic glee that his next target was immediately up next. With the horrific act finished, his sedan tore through the dense forest road under the dark of night, speeding toward his next destination. He stood silently in the dense woods beside a shovel driven deep into the earth, having finished digging a secluded pit. Glancing down at his phone screen, he examined a photograph of the blonde girl, scoffing softly as he dismissed her as nothing more than a foolish brat. With his business in the forest concluded, the car trunk slammed shut and the vehicle sped away into the quiet night. The journey ended in a quiet residential district, where where a modern apartment complex stood dark against the night sky. Stepping through the doorway, he crossed the threshold and unlocked the door to his home. Exhaling a long sigh of fatigue, he shrugged off his jacket and reached directly for a liquor bottle sitting on the counter. Before he could pour a drink, a subtle sound shifted his gaze, his dark eyes narrowing in sudden alertness. Turning his head back over his shoulder, he glanced toward the shadowy interior of his apartment. Standing quietly in the corner was the spiky-haired young challenger, who had broken into the residence unannounced. Fixing him with a sharp, lethal glare, the light-haired youth raised a handgun, sternly asking if he was even listening. He stood unwavering as the dark-haired man stared back at him in stunned silence. Calling out to his host once more, the youth pressed to know if the man was even listening to what he had been saying. Rattled by the sudden intrusion, the man demanded to know the trespasser's identity and why he was brandishing a firearm. The armed youth pressed further, asking if the man had received the message less than a month ago and questioning what he was attempting to accomplish. Raising his gun with absolute resolve, the boy issued a stern ultimatum, warning the man to drop out before he hurt his younger sister. Feigning complete ignorance, the man claimed to know nothing about the threat and desperately tried to dismiss the weapon as nothing more than a toy. Ignoring the plea, the young intruder took a deliberate step forward, causing the man to flinch in alarm. The boy then asked why the man felt compelled to hunt down young girls, questioning if there was any real reason he couldn't simply walk away. Confronted with the blunt question, the man remained frozen, his intense stare offering no explanation. Smirking at the uncomfortable silence, the intruder concluded that his captive audience had no defense to offer. He paused as the older man shouted frantically behind him, desperate for him to wait. In desperate confusion, the target demanded to know the identity of the girl he was trying to protect. Instead of answering, the youth casually aimed his weapon and uttered a sudden, playful imitation of a gunshot. He then scoffed, admitting it was merely a toy all along before dropping a plastic pellet onto the floor and walking away. With a heavy thud, the apartment door slammed shut, leaving complete silence in its wake. Moments later, the quiet night air was broken only by the ambient glow of a lone row of vending machines. The dark-haired man leaned against the illuminated machine, standing motionless in the empty street as he processed the bizarre confrontation. Bringing a cigarette to his lips, he swore under his breath, still trying to shake off the jarring experience. Surrounded by the cold, artificial light, he wondered what madness he had gotten wrapped up in, questioning if the whole ordeal was just a surreal bad dream. A bitter chuckle escaped him as he admitted his own fear, but as he dragged on his cigarette, an alarming realization struck. Something about the entire situation had been deeply, terribly wrong. He barely had a moment to comprehend the sudden chill in the air as sharp, slender projectiles streaked directly toward him. Pausing near an alley wall plastered with notices, his instincts screamed a warning a fraction of a second too late. A violent, sudden blast shattered the quiet night. Before he could brace himself, a blade ripped into his shoulder, pinning him as a wild figure descended upon him out of the darkness. The blonde girl struck with unbridled rage, screaming curses as she repeatedly drove her weapon into his flesh while he choked for air. He desperately pleaded for her to stop, but her unhinged shrieks drowned out his voice as she buried the weapon deeply into his neck. Beneath the lone street lamp along the quiet road, the brutal struggle came to a sudden, absolute silence. He lay motionless on the cold ground, eyes glassy and vacant as blood rapidly pooled beneath him. Left sprawled outside the quiet storefront, his body remained a grim testament to the ruthless assault. Yet whispers lingering in the dark questioned whether the death of Suzuki Tamahito was truly a coincidence, or something far more calculated. He paid close attention to the gruesome news reports detailing the murder site, where a chalk outline marked the spot where the victim had been abandoned along an isolated stretch of road. Because the location was completely deserted and devoid of nearby buildings, several days had passed before anyone finally stumbled upon the decaying remains. Sifting through a pile of newspaper clippings spread out before her, Yuruko read through the official police reports, which noted multiple stab wounds and speculated that the victim had walked 2 kilometers from his home before being slain by what might be a recurring serial killer. Flipping the page, Her eyes caught the sensational headline declaring the deceased to be the fifth sacrifice of the infamous phantom killer haunting Kisaragi town. Sitting alongside her companion in the quiet room, she quietly remarked on what a frightening world they lived in, a sentiment he casually acknowledged with a brief nod. She pondered aloud why the victim was out so late that night, prompting him to coldly assert that the victim must have been a bad person receiving divine retribution, a blunt declaration that deeply shocked her. Unfazed by her outburst, he countered by questioning why playing along with mistaken theories was any less tactless, openly defending his callous point of view. Resting her face gently upon her hand with a serene smile, she brushed the entire matter aside, concluding that the tragedy was ultimately none of her concern anyway. The sound of that single name jolted him awake in an instant, forcing his eyes to snap open into immediate alertness. As his vision blinked into focus, the faint utterance of the name Yumeji continued to linger in his mind like an unsettling whisper. He remained suspended between consciousness and surreal reverie, where upside-down figures suspended with umbrellas drifted through a sky alongside a floating bed. However, these unsettling visions paled in comparison to the grim reality unfolding across the city, where on February 3rd, 29-year-old Riko Kambayashi was found stabbed to death near a canal, marking the brutal debut of the ruthless Kisaragi killer. Months after that initial tragedy, on May 6th, 38-year-old Yuta Kogure was discovered in a warehouse parking lot, his body bearing numerous stab wounds. Barely a week later, on May 14th, 35-year-old Tamaki Tsubura became another victim, ambushed and stabbed along a side street on her way home. The nightmare worsened on August 29th, when 13-year-old middle school student Sayaka Asama collapsed on a forest trail and bled to death from multiple knife wounds. By November 12th, high school teacher Tomohito Suzuki was found dead beside a street vending machine, identified as yet another victim of the violent spree. Just 2 days later, on November 14th, 22-year-old rental shop clerk Kingo Neo was discovered deep within a forest park, bringing the terrifying tally even higher. A delicate hand was held up, ticking off points about the brutal spree of serial murders that had gripped the district of Kisaragi. Outside the quiet classroom, bare tree branches framed the window, offering a gloomy backdrop to the disturbing topic being discussed inside. Gazing thoughtfully out at the scenery, the young student reflected on how the year was drawing to a close while the identity of the perpetrator remained entirely unknown to the authorities. She then turned back around, clutching a folded news clipping in her hand, and expressed her genuine horror at the individual dubbed the Kisaragi ruthless killer. Her companion, a boy with spiky light hair, listened with a bored expression and questioned why she loved dwelling on such gruesome topics, prompting her to pout and plead with him to take the conversation seriously. As the conversation continued beneath the classroom ceiling, the stark facts of the investigation hung heavy in the air. 6 people had been slain in less than 12 months. Raising a finger to emphasize her point, the girl insisted that the official reports were severely lacking, claiming that the police simply had far too little physical evidence to work with. She explained that her detailed knowledge was gathered directly from various mass media reports and news databases, confirming that the public information matched her claims. Skeptical of such an extreme claim, the boy questioned whether it was even possible for a crime scene to leave no trace, but she listed off the baffling reality: no fingerprints, no footprints, and complete coverage gaps in security camera footage. Laying out the entire puzzle, she pointed out that the police were baffled because the victims differed entirely in age, gender, and profession, with no personal grudges or missing possessions, making it impossible to establish a clear motive or pattern for the killings. She pointed out that the single shared thread among all the victims was the sheer brutality of their deaths, concluding that the killer simply murdered for the sake of killing. He pondered her words, questioning if there was not at least some underlying motive or specific obsession driving the assailant, to which she admitted that early investigators had shared that exact theory. Showing him a newspaper article, she explained how the initial 2 murders occurred on matching calendar dates, February 2nd and May 5th, earning the spree the sensational media title of the Reptigit murders. Sitting across from him, she dismissed that pattern as a short-lived coincidence, noting that the 3rd case completely shattered the date theory and left authorities back at square one. assuming pure bloodlust. Silent for a moment, her gaze drifted downward as a subtle shadow crossed her face, pondering the mysterious lack of a true motive. In a haunting mental image, a dark figure towered over a fallen victim, embodying the terrifying mystery of a killer who slays without reason. Watching her closely as she dwelt on the bloody details, he rested his head on his hand and softly asked why she was so consumed by this case. Caught off guard by his direct question, she glanced back at him and quietly conceded that he had a point. Turning her face away once more, a quiet confusion seemed to settle over her as she pondered her own strange preoccupation. Clasping her hands neatly together, she fixed him with an unreadable gaze and asked whether he was truly certain there was only a single killer involved. She admitted that her theory was far from widely accepted, catching her companion off guard as he asked her to clarify. Continuing her thought, she noted that although news outlets eagerly labeled the crimes as serial murders, the police themselves had remained completely silent on the matter, likely struggling with a lack of definitive evidence. In response, he questioned the weapon used, pointing out that several local media outlets had already published reports suggesting multiple killers, citing stark differences in murder weapons and the overall layout of the crime scenes. Drawing attention to the autopsy findings, she confirmed that the stab wounds on the victims indeed suggested entirely different weapon profiles. As he made a stabbing gesture and mused whether the killer simply used a new knife for each attack, she gently corrected him, explaining that this discrepancy served as the core argument for a multi-culprit theory. She outlined terrifying possibilities. A main murderer spawned a copycat, or perhaps an organized group was taking turns carrying out the killings, before asking if he truly believed such a notion. Unsettled by the thought of multiple killers roaming free, he admitted how terrifying that concept was, though she acknowledged that such a theory naturally sounded hard to believe. Suddenly, something caught his attention, prompting him to question whether a knife was even established as the definitive murder weapon in the first place. Turning back to him, she recalled his earlier casual remark and pressed him on why he had assumed the weapon was a knife without absolute proof. Catching himself off guard, he offered a sheepish apology, claiming he had merely spoken on a whim before hastily suggesting it might have been a chef's knife or something similar. He looked at her in confusion as she brought up a sudden connection, recalling another incident when he suggested there might only be a single perpetrator. She went on to explain the eerie parallel, referring to an unresolved case from 3 years prior involving the bizarre murder of an elementary school girl, speculating that the same killer might be at large. He questioned her memory, wondering if that past tragedy had merely been ruled an accident, but she adamantly rejected his doubt, insisting it was undeniably murder. Feigning sudden forgetfulness to deflect the topic, he asked what they were talking about, prompting her to snap back in mild frustration at his bad memory. The horrific details of that winter 3 years ago resurfaced. A young student brutally slain in a residential neighborhood, her neck shredded by relentless blade strikes in an apparent attempt at decapitation. He voiced his skepticism at how abruptly she was linking the two cases, but she prepared to provide a much more compelling connection. She explained that a vital clue tied back to the fourth victim of the recent murders, mentioning a key witness who observed specific trauma on the girl's throat. Upon the victim's neck were identical, horrifying patterns, countless jagged stab wounds echoing the unsolved assault from years before. Listening intently to the chilling similarity, he pressed her on the implication, asking if the perpetrator was truly attempting to sever the victim's head. Sensing the tension rise, she laughed off her own theory, claiming she had merely read about it in a trashy magazine, and that it was probably nothing more than an urban legend. Her thoughts drifted back to a horrific, bloody vision, an unsettling manifestation of the brutal violence that had been haunting her mind. Sitting beside her quiet companion, she openly pondered why she felt such an intense, inexplicable fascination with such gruesome crimes. Surrounded by a clutter of papers, she speculated whether the murderer inhabited a world hidden from ordinary eyes, a realm drifting between dreams and reality that she desperately wished to comprehend. Looking directly at him, she admitted that he was just as baffling and intriguing to her, questioning why his eyes carried the quiet depth of dreams. Noticing her eyelids heavy with exhaustion, he stood up and decided to take his leave, lightheartedly teasing her for falling asleep mid-conversation. Though she wished they could continue talking, she accepted that this was their final moment together for the year and offered him a soft farewell. Resting her head down, she let her eyes close completely, murmuring a final good night into the quiet room. Stepping out into the empty hallway, he slid the classroom door shut to let her sleep undisturbed. Rubbing his forehead in self-reflection, he reminded himself that he needed to exercise much greater caution with what he said. His solemn mood was broken instantly when Suzuki bounced down the corridor in high spirits, cheerfully calling out to him and inviting him to go grab beef bowls together. Her enthusiastic offer receives a calm, measured response as the young man gives a faint nod and agrees to step out with her. Following his agreement, a sharp, unblinking dark gaze lingers in close proximity, casting a subtle air of suspicion as the moment draws to a close. In a quiet bedroom, a bed rests completely buried under a heavy, crumpled quilt. Suddenly, a high-pitched chime cuts through the silence, signaling an incoming notification. On the bedside table, a phone display flickers to life, displaying an unread message next to a flip calendar set to the third day of the month. Prompted by the persistent chime, Shinya slowly emerges from beneath his bedding, his eyes half open with sleep-laden irritation. Shifting upward, he pulls back the covers and glares into the dim room, trying to process the unexpected morning disturbance. Sometime later, he stands outside a desolate, overgrown building, staring silently up at a sign that reads Hasumi Mental Clinic. With deliberate steps, his boots crunching against the cracked concrete exterior, he approaches and pushes open the heavy glass entrance doors. The door creaks softly as he steps across the threshold, entering the silent, vacant lobby of the facility. Advancing alone into the building, the young man makes his way down a long, quiet corridor lined with closed doors, his expression unreadable. He walked through the entrance toward an inner room, casting a subtle glance back at a short-haired young woman following a few paces behind. Stepping into slippers at the doorway, he offered a low, indifferent greeting. Behind him, the woman named Clarissa offered a warm, gentle smile as she stepped inside. As she softly closed the door, he trudged across the wooden floorboards, his narrow eyes scanning the sunlit office ahead. Reclining comfortably in a swivel chair beside a bright window sat a long-haired doctor, her pose entirely relaxed and informal. With a stick resting between her lips, she greeted him with a lazy New Year wish, to which he responded with the exact same monotone greeting. Teasing him about his cold demeanor, she asked Clarissa to fetch them some tea while he stood silently in the middle of the room. Slumping heavily onto the couch opposite her desk, he cut straight to the point, asking what she wanted from him. She began probing him relentlessly, asking if something bad had happened, if he felt isolated at school, or if he was simply nervous around women. Pushed past his limit, he snapped and shouted a stiff, formal New Year greeting just to shut her up, prompting her to chuckle and agree to drop the questioning for now. Giving a condescending gesture, she mockingly praised his sudden effort at communication as if praising a child. His expression darkened in rapid succession, a vein practically throbbing as he mentally seethed at her patronizing attitude, struggling to suppress a violent retort. He pointed out that she had supposedly given up smoking, but she nonchalantly claimed she was merely keeping the unlit cigarette in her mouth. As warm liquid was carefully poured into a teacup, he demanded to know the real reason she had asked him to come. Growing impatient, he scoffed at the idea that she had dragged him all the way across town just because someone was desperate for conversation. Unfazed by his annoyance, the doctor lit her cigarette and acknowledged that someone indeed wanted to speak with him, asking him to wait until the drinks were served. Moments later, Clarissa stepped forward, politely carrying a tray with teacups and setting one down before him. The doctor then revealed that it was not her who wished to see him, but Clarissa herself who had requested the meeting. Turning toward the gentle assistant seated beside him on the couch, he quietly awaited her explanation. Yet instead of offering an answer, she merely beamed at him with a wide, unwavering smile, leaving him completely unsettled. Raising his cup to take a sip, he muttered in disbelief, unable to grasp that he was being dragged into mundane small talk. Slumping lazily against her seat, the doctor sighed and began lightly grilling him with casual inquiries about his health, school, and family life. Taking a slow drag from her cigarette, the physician brushed off his complaints, insisting it was only natural to inquire about a patient's well-being, prompting him to grumble back in irritation. He reluctantly admitted that his tendency to wander aimlessly had diminished, begrudgingly giving her some credit while she continued to casually probe his habits. She abruptly changed the subject, casually asking what he thought of the serial killer making headlines, which jolted him with sudden surprise. He demanded to know what she meant as she airily pondered whether he had ever run into the killer during his late-night excursions. She continued her quiet questioning about his nightly walks through the city, but he flatly dismissed the idea that he had crossed paths with anyone dangerous. He watched silently as her tone shifted into something far sharper, her intense gaze locking onto him as she asked if he had ever met a man named Kitsune. Her heavy question hung in the air, leaving him stunned into a tense, wordless silence. Far from his tense confrontation inside, the blonde girl spent a quiet afternoon outdoors, playing with a stray cat in the courtyard. Walking through the quiet neighborhood streets, the young man made his way along the narrow path between the residential houses. As he continued forward, he ran into an acquaintance crouching on the pavement to play with a stray cat, who greeted him enthusiastically as he gave a brief, nonchalant reply. Instead of getting up, she rolled onto her back directly on the hard pavement, squishing the cat against herself while meowing playfully, prompting him to tell her sternly to stop such disgraceful behavior. Still lying sprawled on the ground, she teased him by recalling how he had previously declared he wouldn't set foot outside for the entirety of spring break, to which he calmly responded that he merely had a few pressing errands to handle. Turning his attention toward the nearby Kuro apartment building, he inquired whether a certain individual was currently inside, leaving her momentarily confused by his indirect way of asking. When she offered an uncertain reply, he clarified that he was referring to the landlord and gave her a light nudge with his foot to prompt a straight answer. Scooping up the cat and resting it comfortably across his shoulder, he explained that his goal was simply to have a brief conversation with her before heading inside. Inside the apartment, he sat on the couch alongside Clarissa with the cat resting on his lap, bringing up the mysterious name Kitsune during their discussion. He pressed further, asking if it was the name of a person, but Clarissa appeared equally baffled by the reference and asked for clarification. He listened in silence as the doctor clarified that Kitsune was merely an alias, admitting she had no idea what the individual's actual name was. Fiddling with a letter opener at her desk, she pressed further, asking if he was fond of blades and collected knives, prompting him to skeptically demand why she was asking. Noticing how freely the woman spoke, he grumbled internally before a sudden realization dawned on him regarding her true motives. Assuring him that she was not judging his interests, the doctor noted that a fascination with such items was quite common among men, with Clarissa quietly observing from beside her. Ashing her cigarette, she added that even someone like herself could develop a secret passion for unusual and peculiar items. She then revealed the specific object of her own obsession, a sword. Holding the small blade while recalling a lost treasure, the doctor explained that she once possessed a cherished sword that was now gone, prompting him to note her use of the past tense. As she prepared to light another cigarette, she lamented that her beloved weapon had been cruelly stolen by a worthless group, fueling her ongoing search for it. Exhaling a plume of smoke, she caught herself smoking again, while he watched her with a calm, unreadable expression. Leaning forward in her chair, the doctor directly questioned where he had acquired his own collection, asking if he bought them from Kitsune, the notorious figure patient spoke of for procuring illegal items. She leaned back slightly, uttering the shadowy figure's title with deliberate composure. Kitsune. He maintained a completely blank expression, flatly denying any knowledge of the name. He listened calmly as she sighed and lightly teased him about his lack of facial expressions, before he pressed her on whether this Kitsune was indeed holding her missing weapon. She rubbed her weary eyes, explaining that the sword was already stolen goods that had passed through countless hands before reaching this town, just as light footsteps began echoing from above. She remarked that if anyone in town possessed clues about its whereabouts, it would be him, unaware of the figure slowly making her way down the wooden staircase. She padded barefooted down the upper corridor, her footsteps rhythmically tapping against the floorboards as she headed toward the stairs. She began calling out loudly for Lisa, while downstairs the young guest offered a polite apology, which the doctor dismissed with a light-hearted laugh. She swung the door wide open with a massive yawn, sleepily demanding juice from Lisa, utterly startling everyone assembled in the study. She blinked drowsily while Clarissa looked on in silence. The youth greeted her with a sarcastic remark, and the doctor offered a playful morning greeting. She rubbed her eyes in sudden shock, staring in total bewilderment at Sheena Shinya sitting comfortably right in front of her. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called out repeatedly for the landlord, while he stood quietly nearby, cradling a black cat inside his jacket. Wondering if anyone was home when no immediate answer came, she was caught off guard as a relaxed voice echoed back from within the doorway. A mysterious figure wearing wooden clogs stepped into the light, greeting the young man with familiar warmth. He maintained his stoic, unbothered expression, explaining in a matter-of-fact tone that he had simply come to deliver his New Year's greetings. Revealing herself to be Mejitsun, the landlord smiled pleasantly and commended his dutiful manners. When Suzuki curiously asked why he was really visiting, he bluntly stated that he had come to claim his wife, causing her to instantly panic in disbelief. Memories linger of the modern-day revival of the street slasher legend in the heart of Japan's vast metropolis. To combat the villains lurking and plundering in the darkness, an enigmatic executioner emerged from the shadows, striking down criminals with the single, glinting sweep of a katana. This self-proclaimed agent of divine retribution spared no mercy, targeting those who exploited society. A corrupt politician leeching public funds, a deceitful entertainer poisoning young girls, and a cult leader spreading dangerous fanaticism. Regardless of whether heaven might forgive them, the blade knew no compassion. Yet, public sentiment remained divided, declaring that punishing evil with violence was inherently evil itself, a criminal act beyond absolution. Declared an outlaw to be hunted down, the phantom executioner abruptly vanished into the night, leaving no trace behind for 15 long years. Years later, the details of those forgotten slayings flickered quietly across a glowing computer monitor. Leaning over the desk, the eccentric young woman pressed close to her companion, eagerly questioning if the documented events were truly authentic. He stared intently at the screen, his mind struggling to connect the legendary assassin described in the news archives to the woman he knew. As she noted that the killings had occurred 15 years ago, he realized the dire implications if the story were true, prompting her to exasperatedly mock his slow realization. The historical records pointed directly to the lethal swordswoman, Hasumi Saiko, a ruthless killer whose bloodthirsty smile matched the brutal nature of her traditional assassinations. Remaining skeptical, he dismissed the idea, demanding to know what possible motive she could have had for such atrocities, while his partner insisted she had already raised that exact question. He listened silently while his companion cackled, listening to her retell how the older woman had once dramatically claimed her past actions were part of a reckless grand scheme for world reformation while slurred with alcohol. Continuing her story, she recalled how the drunk woman had suddenly blurted out that she used to be an assassin long ago, only because the liquor had completely loosened her tongue. He scoffed at the ridiculous tale, insisting it was nothing more than drunken nonsense, though the girl beside him found it endlessly amusing that the woman had remembered nothing the next morning. Sitting together before the illuminated screen, they continued to argue back and forth over whether such an outlandish story could hold even a kernel of truth. Leaning in close with an eager grin, she revealed another bizarre detail, asking him to guess what the woman had answered when questioned about why she stopped after killing 3 people. He stared at her in complete astonishment upon hearing the punchline. The supposed killer had claimed she simply quit because her university studies made her too busy. Shaking his head in disbelief, he muttered that the woman, who miraculously worked as a practicing psychiatrist, was nothing more than an absolute fool. Reflecting deeply on the memory, he noted to himself that this bizarre conversation with Akane had occurred over a year ago, a disturbing revelation he would have preferred never to hear. In truth, he felt no desire to unearth the hidden history of his senior's acquaintance, knowing virtually nothing about Hasumi Saiko and caring even less about her life philosophy or personal values. Yet, as he brooded over the chain of events that eventually dragged her past into the light, he conceded that it all inevitably traced back to the mysterious serial killer and his endless bad luck with women. He stood quietly as Akane recognized the significance of the weapon in question, recalling that she had heard those same frantic, rambling descriptions before. She reasoned that the katana involved had to be the very one Saiko was obsessing over. Taking a quick sip from her glass, she noted how unusual it was for someone like Saiko to show such intense emotional attachment to a single item. She leaned back, trying to recall the specific title of the blade, while explaining that Saiko belonged to an ancient lineage of sword-wielding families. Hearing this historical detail, he remained silent as she added that the weapon had reportedly belonged to Saiko's great-great-grandfather, summarizing that the lost weapon was a cherished family heirloom whose theft naturally drove Saiko into a rage. She suddenly turned the question back onto him, asking why he was so deeply concerned about it. The unsettling realization hit him like a heavy blow. The situation was far worse than he had feared. Meanwhile, the sign at the entrance of a quiet apartment building prominently displayed the name Kuro. As the new year began, Kuro walked alongside him outside, cheerfully asking how he had spent his holiday. When he dryly answered that he had done nothing but sleep, she teased him about whether he had come all this way just to solicit a New Year's gift from her. Waving his hands, he dismissed the idea, but Kuro pleasantly announced that she intended to give him one anyway as a responsible member of society. However, when she turned the tables and inquired if she would receive a present from him in return, he was caught off guard by her bluntness. Offering to step inside and wrap a small gift for him, she casually remarked that she had not yet given a New Year's present to Saiko either. Left standing alone in thought, his panic mounted as he struggled to figure out his next move. Grasping his face in agonizing conflict, he brooded over the terrifying truth. The missing sword carried a deep historical legacy, and Saiko was actively hunting for it. His eyes widened in sheer horror as the realization hit him. The weapon he had so carelessly handled was stolen property, an irreplaceable heirloom. Cursing his own ignorance, he panicked over the terrible mistake he had made. Because he had already parted with the blade, his thoughts flashed back to the transaction itself. He had handed the stolen sword over to Mejitsun, completely oblivious to its true, sinister origin. As he walked along broodingly, the gravity of his mistake weighed heavily upon his shoulders. Solitary and troubled, he slouched forward, deeply disturbed by the mess he had created. He remembered the exact moment he had offered the katana to her, reflecting on why she had been so eager to accept it. To her, an item was not merely steel. If an object possessed a dark history, its worth skyrocketed in her eyes as a dedicated collector. The reason behind her strange enthusiasm stemmed from a disturbingly dark personality trait. Beneath her polite exterior lay the mind of a true necromaniac, someone with an unhealthy fascination for death and the deceased. This morbid desire went beyond simple curiosity, filling her with a strange delight. She found beauty in decay and mortality, swooning over the end of life in ways that others found utterly incomprehensible. She had even subjected him to this morbid passion firsthand, showing off her collection on a laptop packed with gruesome images of crime scenes and corpses that made his stomach turn. Her obsession extended to physical relics left behind by the dead, murder weapons, bloodstained trinkets, and personal effects retrieved from crime victims all held an irresistible power over her distorted tastes. It was that exact morbid appeal that made the antique weapon so alluring when it was drawn from its sheath, carrying the heavy aura of its bloody heritage. Remembering the moment he handed it over, he recalled how her eyes lit up with sheer delight as she took possession of the weapon, confirming that the dangerous heirloom was now firmly in her hands. Her possession of the stolen weapon meant that an item of extreme, dangerous value was now out in the open. Watching from a distance, the young man stood silently, desperate to ensure that the two volatile girls in his life would never encounter one another. He resolved to reclaim the stolen sword as quickly as possible, just as the spectacled girl strolled up, calling out a breezy apology for her delay. She stepped forward to hand out festive gifts, presenting a small slip of filter paper to her energetic companion, who squealed with delight. She then handed a matching slip to the quiet youth, who quietly thanked her, only for the twin-tailed girl to cut in, announcing that she required something bizarre in return. Leaning in close to the startled boy, the girl with glasses asked him directly if he had heard about the modern-day resurgence of the infamous street slayer, sending a violent shock of terror through his mind. Reflecting on the relentless pressure of her daily existence, The girl in spectacles remarked on how life seemed to throw one unyielding trial after another without mercy. Yet, as she stood near the doorway, she pondered whether this constant struggle was precisely what made a person feel truly alive. She struck a playful pose, playfully sticking out her tongue behind the gleaming reflection of her round spectacles. Meanwhile, a sinister presence loomed in the shadows, a dark-haired assassin wearing dark sunglasses, radiating a cold and lethal aura. She stood quietly in an open entrance holding her blade, dismissively expressing ignorance regarding her infamous reputation as a modern-day street slasher. Back in the room, the spectacled girl shouted in disbelief at her companion's lack of awareness, while he merely stared back with an irritated and indifferent expression. Elsewhere, stealthy footsteps creaked softly against the floorboards of a quiet hallway. Watching silently from behind, the dark assassin locked her gaze on an unsuspecting man standing at the far end of the office. Unaware of the threat creeping behind him, the man continued arguing animatedly on his phone inside his dark office. Without a word, she quietly drew her sword from its sheath, preparing to strike her target. Far away from the blood-soaked hallway, the exhausted boy stared blankly, wondering if he was being tested by some unseen force. Beside him, his eccentric companion continued her rapid-fire chatter without breaking breath, spewing endless trivia about obscure urban legends. He sank into his thoughts, desperately wishing to abandon the whole conversation, go home, and fall asleep in front of the television. Glancing back at her, the youth felt a surge of frustration, convinced that this bizarre situation was yielding no answers whatsoever. She sat nearby, dissecting the strange connections between the recent incidents and pondering whether some hidden force was orchestrating them all. Unable to take any more, he finally cut her off, demanding that she drop the gruesome slasher stories that seemed so strangely aligned with her personal tastes. Rather than stopping, she enthusiastically launched into another historical case, forcing him to interrupt again to demand why she kept bringing up the modern-day killer. As they walked together, she revealed her true angle, bringing up the katana he had given her and confirming his suspicion that the blade was her real focus. He questioned her about the blade's elegant title, Song of the Mist, while she tapped her chin in an effort to recall the exact inscription on the steel. Closing the distance between them, she leaned in with a sharp, chilling smile, demanding to uncover the true identity and secret origins behind his legendary weapon. She stood opposite the young swordsman in the quiet space between the buildings, her posture confident as she prepared to unpack her story. Continuing her discourse, the girl noted how little was truly known about the blade, remarking that an object neglected by a family had been willingly passed over. Her tone suddenly shifted as she questioned whether the weapon was genuine, revealing that a friend of hers had been killed just half a month prior. While acknowledging that her deceased companion was hardly a good person, having dealt in illicit trade up north, she emphasized that his fate was far from ordinary. Pointed in her inquiry, she pressed the boy on how he imagined such a man had met his end. Leaning in dangerously close, she vividly described how the victim had been sliced clean in half by a blade, completely annihilated in an instant. Driven by pure curiosity, she explained that she had been collecting items from his contraband business to piece together why these traders were being targeted. Horror-tinged memories of the crime scenes came to light, showing numerous traders cut down in cold blood within shadowy corridors. After obtaining gruesome photos from her network of acquaintances, she stared intently back at her companion, knowing the evidence was undeniable. Throwing her hands out in dramatic certainty, the young woman declared beyond a shadow of a doubt that these killings were the work of the phantom sword slayer, the Tsujijiri. Her eyes dilated in sheer disbelief behind her round spectacles as a harrowing question gripped her mind, wondering why those monsters had resurfaced after a decade of silence. As the weight of her words settled in, he suddenly collapsed onto his knees, his mind racing to comprehend what Hasumi Saiko could possibly be doing. Before he could gather his thoughts, she pounced forward and aggressively seized his collar, demanding that he confess everything he knew about the situation. Driven by a manic intensity, she got right into his face and pressed him about the katana, demanding to know where it truly came from and whose blood had rusted its sharp edge, desperate to confirm her dark premonition. Unshaken by her intense outburst, he maintained a steady gaze and quietly requested the immediate return of his sword. When she balked in utter disbelief at his audacity, he plainly repeated his demand, stressing that the blade had become far too important to leave in her hands. Meanwhile, their companion crouched on the ground sorting cards, casually reminding him that his primary duty was to protect his younger sister rather than obsessing over dangerous matters. Incensed by the distraction, she snapped back fiercely, declaring that their prior agreement gave him no right to lecture her and emphasizing that protecting his sister was already her own firm intention. He paused, finding it difficult to articulate the truth, before finally confessing that the katana in question did not belong to the notorious Tsujijiri. Her explosive fury instantly evaporated into stunned silence, leaving her staring at him as she struggled to process his revelation. She quickly clarified her intent, explaining that simply asking for the katana back wasn't what she meant, and offered to provide him with a suitable substitute to make amends. Before their dialogue could proceed any further, a loud shout echoed across the open grounds, abruptly interrupting the heavy mood. Waving enthusiastically with an upbeat smile, the cheerful girl called out to him with affection, shattering the remaining tension. In the quiet expanse of her spacious room, surrounded by tall bookshelves, the dark-haired woman sat motionless in an armchair, her sword resting across her lap. Her gaze remained fixed ahead, cold and unblinking as she contemplated the blade in silence. Every contour of her form reflected a deep, unsettled composure, her hands remaining near the weapon as if bound to it by an invisible thread. Sitting alone in the silent room, she acknowledged the dark truth within herself. Despite her best efforts, an unhealthy obsession was slowly taking hold of her mind. Meanwhile, in a deserted neighborhood park, the young swordsman met with the energetic girl beside a small playground ride. He began by offering an apology for summoning her on her day off, but she instantly brushed his concern aside with an enthusiastic shout of greeting. Noticing his unusually drained expression, she asked if he was feeling worn out, before quickly rambling that getting to meet him outside of school made her too excited to care about his exhaustion. Stepping past the trivial pleasantries, he changed the subject directly, asking whether she had brought the item he had requested. She eagerly confirmed that she had, proudly pulling out a small feline trinket with a beaming smile while he looked on intently. Fixing her with a serious gaze, he promised that he would deliver something to her soon in exchange for the katana. He had successfully captured her full attention, prompting the bespectacled girl to smirk and adjust her glasses while warning him not to disappoint her. To substantiate their claims, a gloved hand produced a sleek flash drive loaded with critical evidence. Akane gleefully detailed the drive's contents, explaining that it held the gruesome video archive left behind by the notorious Suzuki Tamahito. The dark reality behind those recordings reflected Psycho's cold calculus, having exploited the murderer's depravity as a convenient screen to advance her own hidden agenda. Absorbing this grim context, the young swordsman deduced that Kuro, the key figure known as Mejitsun, would likely agree to their proposed bargain. Expressing genuine relief, he admitted that her intervention had saved him, prompting the girl to wave off his gratitude with boastful cheer. While handing over the small cat charm, she secretly savored the rare opportunity to assist him, completely unaware of his sudden shift in posture. In an instant, her playful mood evaporated as she registered a sudden surge of hostility. Without a word of warning, he pinned her violently against the bench, towering over her with overwhelming authority. Fixing her with an intense, unyielding glare, he confronted her directly about her true identity as panic set in. Standing over her, he pressed for answers as she nervously realized he had been present at the internet cafe, demanding to know if he had overheard her. In response to his intimidating gaze, she offered a sheepish grin, attempting to mask her panic behind an innocent smile. Unmoved by her playfulness, his suspicion deepened as he demanded to know if she had also targeted Hasumi and Mejitsun. Succumbing to the pressure, she finally admitted her involvement, insisting she had only shared a small piece of information with the dangerous woman known as Psycho. She elaborated on how she contacted the killer online, leaking the detail that the katana was currently located in Kisaragi City to provoke her into making a move. When he questioned why she would leak such dangerous details, she simply replied that the sword was destined to be uncovered anyway. To justify her actions, she recalled how he himself had retrieved the blade from its original resting place to deliver it to the Kitsune woman. Drawing connections between the past and present, she brought up the names of Hasumi and Yugi to highlight the unraveling mystery. She noted that he had instinctively concealed certain details during his previous interactions, driven by a deep-seated connection to Psycho. Concluding her rationale with a light-hearted smile, she confessed to giving fate a subtle push, certain that he shared her intuition that a critical event was about to occur. She listened quietly as Shinya pressed her for answers, demanding to know what her true objective had been all along. She nonchalantly explained that shaking things up between the Psycho woman and the Kitsune woman seemed like a fine idea to stir the pot. With a carefree grin, she added that drawing the vampire and the slasher into the chaotic mix was just an added bonus for her own amusement. Her outrageous logic left him completely speechless, staring back at her in sheer disbelief. Overwhelmed by exasperation at her reckless meddling, he massaged his temples and heaved a heavy sigh. Leaving her behind, he rubbed his tired eyes as he trudged through the chilly outdoor air, trying to process the mess he was now caught in. Thus, the consequences rippled outward. Kuro diligently analyzed her finding at her laptop as the one who gained ground, while Psycho sat alone in shadowy solitude as the one left empty-handed. And yet, despite the chaotic web of schemes, the wrapped katana remained safely retrieved and secured. Returning home at last, he was warmly greeted by his younger sister, offering a comforting respite from the night's ordeals. As his sister playfully teased him about the cold room and setting up the kotatsu, he quietly breathed a sigh of relief, realizing he had successfully kept the dangerous weapon hidden away from their home. Unbeknownst to him, Kuro was carefully examining the long, wrapped bundle she had acquired, noting its heavy weight and pondering if it was made of solid metal. Meanwhile, back at his house, his sister babbled cheerfully about her fleeting interests, while he stood quietly by the door, completely detached from her chatter. His gaze sharpened as his thoughts centered on an unsettling reality regarding that katana. That weapon was not the infamous blade belonging to the Street Slayer, despite what others believed. He pieced together its history. It was supposedly a family heirloom, not the legendary sword linked to historic assassinations, for the lives cut down by its edge bore a far more personal tragedy. Standing alone in silent contemplation, he confronted the tragic origin of the blade. It was the weapon that had taken the life of his and his sister's mother.